Welcome, weary hollow, to a journey through the mysteries that lie hidden in the shadows of dark souls. Tonight, we venture beyond the surface of this beloved saga, exploring the countless theories that have emerged from its cryptic depths. Here, in this space between waking and dreaming, we'll unravel the enigmas of basilisks and serpents, delve into painted worlds and forgotten kingdoms, and examine the subtle threads that connect all three games. So settle into the darkness, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift through the most intriguing mysteries of Lordran, Drangliac, and Lothric. Close your eyes when ready, and let these ancient puzzles carry you toward peaceful rest. In the beginning, there were creatures that seemed simple, yet carried within them layers of deception that would take years for curious minds to unravel. Among the most frustrating enemies that souls have encountered across their journeys through dying worlds, few inspire quite the same mixture of annoyance and fascination as the basilisks. These accursed beings, also known as curse frogs, appear in every corner of the Dark Souls universe, from the depths beneath the undead Burg to the twisted landscapes of the Ringed City, and even beyond into the lands between of Elden Ring. Their reputation precedes them wherever hollow feet might tread. The deadly mist that pours from their grotesque forms carries with it the power of instant death, a curse so potent that it can reduce even the mightiest warrior to a fragile shell of crystallized despair. Yet it is not merely their lethality that makes these creatures so memorable to those who have faced them. There is something deeper, something more unsettling about their presence that goes beyond mere mechanical frustration. For years, those who encountered basilisks accepted what they saw at face value. The massive, bulging eyes that dominated their appearance seemed to stare with malevolent intelligence, watching every movement with the patience of predators who had all eternity to wait for their prey to make a fatal mistake. These eyes appeared to be windows into alien thoughts, organs of perception so large and prominent that they dominated the creature's entire form, speaking to some fundamental wrongness in their very existence. But appearances, as any student of the souls has learned, can be profoundly deceiving. The revelation, when it finally came, was both simple and transformative in its implications. Those massive, intimidating orbs that had haunted so many encounters were not eyes at all, but elaborate facades, biological theatre, designed to mislead and intimidate. The true eyes of the basilisk were small, dark specks hidden beneath these false displays, tiny organs of sight that observed the world from their concealed positions, while their owners perpetrated one of nature's most elaborate deceptions. This discovery sent ripples through the community of those who studied these creatures, not merely because it corrected a long-held misconception, but because it revealed the profound intelligence behind their design. The basilisks were not simply monsters that happened to possess unusual anatomy. They were architects of illusion, creatures whose very bodies were weapons of psychological warfare designed to exploit the assumptions and fears of those who encountered them. The natural world provides numerous examples of such deceptive practices. Butterflies display false eyes on their wings to startle predators and create the illusion of being larger, more dangerous creatures than they actually are. Frogs and toads use similar techniques, presenting eye spots that suggest the presence of much larger animals. Birds too employ these tactics, using patterns and markings to confuse and misdirect potential threats. In each case, the principle remains the same: survival through misdirection, protection through the manipulation of perception. Yet the basilisk's deception runs deeper than mere mimicry of natural defensive mechanisms. Their false eyes serve not only to intimidate, but to embody a more fundamental principle that runs through the very heart of the Dark Souls universe. They are creatures of the curse, beings whose existence is intimately connected with the concept of death itself. and their anatomy reflects this terrible purpose in ways that become clear only when examined through the lens of ancient mythology and forgotten lore. The basilisk of European legend was a creature of such malevolent power that its very gaze could kill. Medieval bestiaries described it as a serpent or dragon whose breath could wither plants and whose eyes could bring death to any living thing foolish enough to meet its stare directly. Pliny the Elder wrote of basilisks that could destroy shrubs merely by breathing upon them, creatures whose noxious influence was so tremendous that it could break stone and cause death to those who merely looked upon them. In Dark Souls, these legendary creatures find new expression through beings that carry forward the essential nature of their mythological ancestors, while adapting to the specific metaphysical reality of a world caught between fire and darkness. The Eye of Death that basilisks sometimes drop serves as more than mere crafting material. It is a tool for spreading disaster across neighboring worlds, a means of proliferating the very curse that defines their existence. This item allows its bearer to invade other realms as a spirit of vengeance, spreading the influence of death and curse beyond the boundaries of any single world. Some theories suggest that the basilisk's false eyes serve as more than mere intimidation devices. These massive organs might themselves be manifestations of the toxic gases that pour from the creature's bodies, literal eyes of death that embody the cursed vapors in visible form. While this interpretation remains speculative, it carries a certain poetic justice that resonates with the symbolic nature of these beings. If the basilisks are indeed living embodiments of the curse itself, then their false eyes might represent the deceptive nature of death, the way that mortality masquerades as something fearsome and alien when it is, in fact, the most natural and inevitable aspect of existence. This interpretation gains additional weight when considered alongside the basilisks that appear in Dark Souls 2, creatures that no longer possess the massive false eyes of their counterparts from other ages, yet retain their ability to breathe forth the toxic mists that define their essential nature. This variation suggests that the false eyes, while dramatic and memorable, are not fundamental to the basilisk's curse-spreading capabilities. They are ornamental rather than functional, theatrical rather than necessary, which paradoxically makes them more, rather than less significant, from a symbolic perspective. The presence of basilisks in the Elden Ring serves as a bridge between the Dark Souls universe and newer mythological territories, demonstrating how certain fundamental concepts transcend the boundaries of individual worlds. These creatures appear not as direct imports from earlier games, but as natural expressions of universal principles that manifest wherever the proper conditions exist. They are living proof that some forms of deception and curse are so fundamental to the nature of reality that they appear wherever conscious beings must confront the inevitability of death and the fragility of perception. Yet even as we unpack the layers of meaning embedded in these creatures, there remains something beautifully mysterious about their presence in the world. They exist at the intersection of natural and supernatural, combining biological realism with mythological significance in ways that resist simple categorization. They are simultaneously frustrating enemies to be overcome and philosophical puzzles to be contemplated, creatures whose true nature reveals itself only to those patient enough to look beyond surface appearances. The basilisks remind us that in a universe where gods can fall and ages can end, where time itself becomes unreliable and reality bends under the weight of accumulated contradictions, even the most basic assumptions about what we see and experience must be questioned. They are teachers, in their own terrible way, instructing all who encounter them in the fundamental lesson that appearances can deceive, that what seems most obvious is often most false, and that survival requires not just strength and skill, but the wisdom to see through elaborate deceptions to the truth that lies beneath. But the basilisks are not the only creatures in the Dark Souls universe that serve as instructors in the arts of hidden truth and concealed meaning. Throughout these ancient lands, there are phenomena that speak to attentive listeners, voices that whisper secrets to those who know how to hear them, and mysteries that reveal themselves only to the most dedicated seekers of forbidden knowledge. In the depths of the Duke's archives, that grand repository of learning and madness where Seath the Scaleless conducted his obsessive research into the nature of immortality, there exists an acoustic phenomenon that most visitors dismiss as merely atmospheric background noise. The ancient halls echo with sounds that seem, on first listening, to be nothing more than the natural ambience of a vast, ancient structure. The settling of stones, the movement of air through forgotten passages, the subtle reverberations that any large building produces as it exists through time. Yet those who pause to listen more carefully, who resist the urge to rush through these halls in pursuit of more obvious treasures, begin to detect patterns within the seemingly random audio landscape. There are rhythms that suggest intention rather than accident, modulations that hint at meaning rather than mere mechanical noise. Most intriguingly, there are what can only be described as whispers, human voices speaking words that remain just beyond the threshold of clear comprehension, conversations that seem to emerge from the very stones of the archive itself. When these audio phenomena are examined through modern techniques, when the ambient sounds of the Duke's archives are isolated and enhanced, using tools that would have seemed like magic to the scholars who once walked these halls, clear and intentional whispers emerge from what initially appeared to be random noise. These are not accidental audio artifacts or the products of overeager imagination, but deliberately placed elements of the archive's acoustic environment, voices that speak with purpose even though their words remain tantalizingly unclear. The question that naturally arises from this discovery is both simple and profound. Who is speaking, and what are they trying to say? The Duke's archive stands as one of the most tragic locations in all of Lordran, a place where the pursuit of knowledge transformed into something monstrous and consuming. The vast library that Duke Seath created using his fragment of Gwyn's Lord Soul was intended to serve as a center of learning and research, a repository where the greatest minds of the age could gather to unlock the secrets of existence itself. Instead, it became a laboratory of horrors, a place where the scaleless dragon's obsession with achieving the immortality that had been denied him by his unusual birth drove him to experiments that grew increasingly desperate and morally questionable. The channelers who served him scoured the land for human subjects, particularly maidens whose essential nature might hold keys to the secrets that Seath sought to uncover. These unfortunate individuals were imprisoned in massive cells within the archive, their bodies subjected to transformations and experiments whose purposes died with their perpetrator. The Picasa that roam the archive's halls, those twisted beings whose forms suggest the results of failed attempts to recreate or understand the nature of immortality, drop items that connect them directly to the maidens who once served Guinevere, the Princess of Sunlight. The miracle bountiful sunlight, which some of these creatures carry, is described as being specially related to these holy women, suggesting a direct connection between Seath's experimental subjects and the religious hierarchy that once brought order and meaning to the Age of Fire. This connection opens the most obvious interpretation of the whispers that echo through the archive's halls. Perhaps these voices belong to the imprisoned maidens, souls trapped within the very structure of their prison, forever speaking words of anguish, supplication, or warning to any who might hear them. Their imprisonment was not merely physical but spiritual, their essence bound to the place of their suffering in ways that persist long after their bodies have been transformed or destroyed. Yet this explanation, while emotionally satisfying and dramatically appropriate, faces complications when similar whispers are discovered in Dark Souls 2, echoing through locations that have no direct connection to Seath's experiments or the tragedy of the imprisoned maidens. The Modular Mansion, with its mysterious contents and forgotten history, contains audio phenomena that bear striking resemblances to those found in the Duke's archives, suggesting that the whispers represent something more universal than the specific suffering of particular victims. Alternative theories propose that these voices arise not from individual tragedies, but from more fundamental aspects of the Dark Souls universe's metaphysical structure. Some suggest that the whispers represent the byproducts of forbidden knowledge itself, the acoustic shadows cast by truths too dangerous or complex for normal human consciousness to process. In this interpretation, places where powerful magic has been practiced or ancient secrets have been studied naturally develop these phenomena as a side effect of exposure to forces that exist partially outside normal reality. This theory finds support in Bloodborne, that sister work where exposure to cosmic truths produces similarly disturbing auditory phenomena. When hunters consume Madman's knowledge, they begin to hear whispers that seem to emerge from sources beyond normal perception, voices that speak of realities too vast and alien for human comprehension. While Bloodborne operates in a different universe with different rules, the parallels suggest that certain responses to forbidden knowledge may be universal, manifesting wherever conscious beings attempt to grasp truths that exceed their natural limitations. The Duke's archives certainly qualifies as a place where such boundaries were regularly transgressed. Seath's research into immortality required him to investigate the fundamental nature of souls, the basic building blocks from which all conscious existence is constructed. His experiments with crystal magic represented attempts to impose artificial order on natural processes, to create permanent structures from forces that were meant to flow and change. The moonlight butterfly that emerges from his research demonstrates his ability to create life itself, to bring consciousness into existence through purely magical means. Such activities would naturally leave traces in the environment where they occurred, metaphysical residues that might manifest as audio phenomena perceivable by those sensitive enough to detect them. The whispers might represent fragments of soul energy that became embedded in the archive structure, pieces of consciousness that achieved a kind of permanence through their association with Seath's crystalline magic, but lack the coherence necessary for full, independent existence. This interpretation helps explain why similar phenomena appear in other locations associated with soul manipulation and magical experimentation. In Dark Souls 2, the Modular Mansion contains what may be the broken remnants of the Lord Vessel, that crucial artifact which once held the most powerful souls in existence. If the whispers are indeed related to soul fragmentation and magical resonance, then a location where such a significant soul-manipulating device was destroyed would naturally develop similar acoustic anomalies. The Emerald Herald, that mysterious figure who guides the bearer of the curse through their journey in Drangleic, speaks of how King Vendrick peered into the essence of souls, conducting experiments that paralleled Seath's research in their ambition and their moral ambiguity. Vendrick's creation of golems, artificial beings powered by soul energy, represents another form of consciousness manipulation that might leave lasting traces in the environment where it was performed. The statues that dot the landscape of Drangleic, those silent sentinels powered by souls and animated by forces that transcend normal understanding, might themselves be sources of the whispers that echo through various locations. These artificial beings possess a form of consciousness, but one that operates according to principles very different from natural awareness. Their attempts to communicate or express themselves might manifest as the barely comprehensible voices that haunt places where they were created or studied. Yet, Even as we explore these various explanations for the whispers that permeate certain locations throughout the Dark Souls universe, there remains another audio phenomenon that demands attention and interpretation. Throughout the silver halls of Anor Londo, that divine city where gods once walked among mortals, and the very architecture sang with celestial harmony, there echo sounds that have no visible source. The rhythmic fall of footsteps on marble floors, the opening and closing of great doors, the subtle sounds of movement and activity that suggest the presence of beings who cannot be seen. These phantom footsteps are not random or chaotic but purposeful, suggesting individuals going about their business with clear destinations and intentions. They move through the halls with the confidence of familiarity, the regular patterns of routine activity. Most intriguingly, they seem to follow pathways that make sense within the architecture of Anor Londo, respecting the layout of rooms and corridors, avoiding obstacles, and generally behaving as though they belong to entities that possessed both intelligence and intimate knowledge of their environment. The most straightforward interpretation of these phenomena suggests that they represent the ghostly echoes of players who have died in these locations, their final moments somehow imprinted upon the environment in ways that persist beyond their individual existence. In a universe where death is neither permanent nor final, where the undead curse ensures that failure leads not to ending but to endless repetition, it would not be surprising if the accumulated weight of countless defeats left traces that could be perceived by those sensitive to such impressions. This theory gains poetic resonance from the knowledge that Anor Londo has witnessed the struggles of countless chosen undead over the centuries, heroes who climbed the great heights of the divine city in pursuit of their destined encounters with Ornstein and Smaug, only to fall short of their ultimate goals. The phantom footsteps might represent the collected memory of all these attempts, the accumulated echo of noble failures and tragic defeats, preserved within the very stones of the cathedral. Alternative explanations suggest that these sounds arise from temporal distortions, acoustic artifacts from periods when Anor Londo was populated by living residents going about their daily routines. If time truly is convoluted in these ancient places, if the boundaries between past and present have become blurred through the accumulated weight of supernatural forces, then sounds from earlier ages might bleed through into the present, creating auditory windows into periods when these halls echoed with genuine activity rather than merely its ghostly reflection. The illusions that Gwyndolin maintained throughout Anor Londo might provide another explanation for these mysterious sounds. The Dark Sun's power extended beyond mere visual deception to encompass all forms of sensory manipulation, creating comprehensive alternate realities that could fool even the most perceptive visitors into believing they experienced something that existed only in his imagination. The phantom footsteps might represent elements of these illusions that persisted even after Gwyndolin's power waned, audio components of artificial realities that achieved a kind of independent existence through the sheer force of will that originally brought them into being. Yet as we contemplate these various explanations for the mysterious audio phenomena that permeate the Dark Souls universe, we encounter creatures that embody mystery in more visual and immediate ways. In the shadowed corners of Drangleic, there exist beings whose very existence challenges our understanding of what it means to be seen, to be present, to occupy space in a reality that seems increasingly flexible in its fundamental rules. The invisible hollows of Dark Souls too represent perhaps the most poignant expression of the curse that defines so much of the experience in these dying worlds. These are beings who have not simply lost their humanity or their sanity, but have begun to lose their very existence itself, fading from visible reality while retaining just enough presence to continue their endless, purposeless existence. They can be detected only through the use of light sources or special rings that reveal their presence to those who possess the proper tools for perceiving them. When discovered, these invisible hollows do not attack or threaten those who find them. Instead, they sit in positions of dejection and despair, eternal monuments to the futility of existence in a world where even death provides no reliable escape from suffering. The Ring of Whispers allows the perceptive to hear their inner voices, revealing the thoughts and feelings of beings who have moved beyond the normal boundaries of interactive existence while retaining their capacity for consciousness and emotion. The tragedy of these creatures lies not in their hostility or danger, but in their complete isolation from the world around them. They exist in a liminal space between being and non-being, conscious but unable to affect their environment, aware but incapable of meaningful communication with others. They represent the logical endpoint of the hollowing process, the final stage of a curse that strips away first meaning, then memory, then identity, and finally even the basic presence that allows a being to exist as part of the shared reality that others inhabit. Various theories attempt to explain how these beings came to exist in such a state. The most straightforward suggests that invisible hollows represent simply the natural progression of the undead curse, the final stage that awaits all those who lose their purpose and allow despair to consume their essential nature. After a hollow has existed for long enough, after they have exhausted every possible source of meaning or motivation, they might simply begin to fade away, becoming gradually less real, until they exist only as barely perceptible shadows of their former selves. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the specific nature of their condition. Why invisibility, rather than complete dissolution? Why the retention of consciousness and emotion, rather than the simple ending that would seem more merciful? The invisible hollows seem to occupy a very particular metaphysical position, one that suggests their condition might be the result of specific circumstances, rather than merely the natural progression of universal processes. Aldea, the scholar of the first sin, conducted experiments throughout Drangleic that focused on understanding and potentially overcoming the fundamental curses that plagued existence in the waning Age of Fire. His manor served as a laboratory where various forms of life were subjected to transformations designed to test the boundaries of what was possible within the constraints of the current metaphysical system. The Spitfire Spear mentions mysterious experiments conducted on those invited to his manor, individuals who disappeared in ways that might connect directly to the invisible hollows found throughout the realm. The distribution of invisible hollows throughout Drangleic, with concentrations near Aldea's keep and in the undead crypt where the curse-afflicted are laid to rest, suggests that their condition might indeed be artificial rather than natural. Perhaps they represent failed experiments in transcending the normal limitations of existence, attempts to move beyond the cycle of death and rebirth that proved only partially successful. Instead of achieving true transcendence, these subjects might have become trapped in an intermediate state, visible enough to retain consciousness, but invisible enough to be cut off from meaningful interaction with the world. The hidden body sorcery found in the original Dark Souls provides another potential explanation for the invisible hollows condition. This ancient magic from the lost land of Ulasil granted its users the ability to become nearly invisible, blending into their environment with astounding effectiveness. The description warns that perfect invisibility is impossible due to the risk of dissipation, suggesting that complete removal from visible reality carries with it the danger of losing coherent existence altogether. Perhaps the invisible hollows represent individuals who were subjected to variations of this sorcery, either voluntarily or as part of experimental procedures, but who lacked the strength or knowledge necessary to maintain the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. Instead of achieving the controlled invisibility that the original sorcery provided, they became trapped in a state where they could neither return to full visibility nor risk the complete dissipation that perfect invisibility would bring. This interpretation casts the invisible hollows in an even more tragic light, as beings who sought to escape their cursed existence through magical means only to discover that the alternatives available to them were no better than the fate they originally sought to avoid. They represent the terrible irony that runs through so much of the Dark Souls narrative. The way that attempts to transcend or escape fundamental limitations often lead only to new forms of suffering that are more subtle but no less profound than what came before. The Ring of Whispers, which allows their inner voices to be heard, provides the only means of communication available to these isolated beings. Through this device, the cursed can gain glimpses into the consciousness of creatures who have moved beyond normal existence while retaining their capacity for thought and feeling. The whispers they speak tell of loneliness, confusion, and a desperate hope that someone might discover them and perhaps provide some form of relief from their endless isolation. Yet as we contemplate these various mysteries that populate the audio and visual landscape of the Dark Souls universe, we begin to recognize patterns that suggest deeper connections between phenomena that might initially seem unrelated. The whispers that echo through ancient halls, the phantom footsteps that mark the passage of unseen entities, and the barely visible forms of the invisible hollows all speak to a fundamental characteristic of these dying worlds. They are places where the boundaries between different states of existence have become blurred and permeable. In healthy realities, there are clear distinctions between the living and the dead, the present and the past, the visible and the invisible. But the Dark Souls universe exists in a state of metaphysical decay, where the artificial prolongation of the Age of Fire has created stresses and distortions that affect the basic structure of reality itself. The whispers, footsteps, and invisible beings we encounter are not separate phenomena, but different expressions of the same underlying condition. A world where the normal rules of existence have been compromised by forces too vast and complex for any single consciousness to fully comprehend. These mysteries remind us that even in our exploration of the most obscure corners of these ancient worlds, there remain depths that have yet to be fully plumbed, secrets that continue to whisper their truths to those patient enough to listen. They invite us to look beyond the obvious, to question our assumptions about what we see and hear, and to remain open to the possibility that the most profound revelations often come not through dramatic confrontations or epic battles, but through careful attention to the subtle details that others might dismiss as mere atmospheric decoration. As we prepare to journey deeper into the mysteries that await us in other regions of these interconnected worlds, we carry with us the lessons taught by basilisks and whispers, by phantom footsteps and invisible souls. We have learned that deception is fundamental to the nature of these realities, that truth often hides behind elaborate facades, and that the most important discoveries frequently come to those who are willing to look beyond surface appearances, to the deeper patterns that connect seemingly disparate phenomena. The sky above these ancient lands holds many more secrets than those we have explored tonight. But these initial mysteries serve as preparation for the greater revelations that await us. They teach us the skills of careful observation and patient interpretation that will serve us well as we venture into territories where the very concepts of time and space, identity and purpose, beginning and ending, are subjected to forces that transform them into something strange and wonderful and terrible all at once. High above the mortal realm, where clouds gather like memories and ancient stones reach toward skies that have witnessed the rise and fall of ages, there exists a place that defies easy categorization within the established geography of known worlds. Archdragon Peak stands as a monument to mysteries that transcend the simple passage of time, a location where the boundaries between past and present, truth and illusion, devotion and betrayal have become so blurred that even the most careful observer must question the nature of what they perceive. The peak itself presents as a shrine to the ancient dragons, those primordial beings whose existence predated the Age of Fire and whose legacy continues to echo through every subsequent age. Despite their apparent extinction, the architecture that crowns this elevated sanctuary speaks of human hands guided by draconic inspiration, structures that combine the geometric precision of mortal craftsmanship with the organic flow of forms that seem to have grown rather than been built. Here, among weathered stones and crumbling platforms, the devoted once came to pay homage to powers that represented everything the current age had moved beyond. Yet even in this place dedicated to reverence and remembrance, there exist details that jar the careful observer from their contemplation, elements so out of place that they serve as reminders of just how strange and layered the reality of these ancient worlds has become. Near the first bonfire that greets visitors to this elevated shrine, there stands a stone monument covered with inscriptions that, when examined closely, reveal themselves to be written in Arabic script. The text itself, when finally deciphered by those with the linguistic skills necessary for such work, proves to contain references to Egyptian railway development, discussions of ministerial anger over delayed hospital construction, mundane bureaucratic concerns that have no conceivable connection to the mythological significance of the location where they appear. This discovery serves as a perfect introduction to one of the most perplexing aspects of the Dark Souls universe: the presence of elements that seem to have wandered in from entirely different contexts, anachronisms that challenge our understanding of the internal consistency that we expect from carefully crafted fictional worlds. The Arabic inscriptions at Archdragon Peak are not unique in their incongruity. Throughout the series, particularly in Dark Souls 2, there appear textures and objects that belong more properly to contemporary reality than to the medieval fantasy setting that frames the narrative. In the depths of the gutter, that vertical maze of abandoned platforms and discarded refuse that serves as Drangleiac's unofficial landfill, careful exploration reveals the presence of modern automobile tires, their distinctive tread patterns unmistakably contemporary, despite their placement in a world that knows nothing of internal combustion engines or industrial rubber production. Nearby, the remnants of what appears to be a Heineken beer bottle label can be found among the debris, while other locations yield similar anachronistic artifacts that seem to have wandered in from our own world like temporal refugees seeking shelter in a more mythologically coherent reality. The explanation for these incongruities, when it finally emerged from the development studios responsible for creating these worlds, proved to be both mundane and oddly disappointing. The Arabic text at Archdragon Peak was simply borrowed from an unrelated source, chosen for its visual impact rather than its semantic content, a piece of exotic decoration that was never intended to be decoded or analyzed for meaning. Similarly, the modern objects scattered throughout various locations represent the repurposing of digital assets, texture files originally created for entirely different projects that found their way into Dark Souls through the practical necessities of game development rather than through any conscious artistic decision. Yet even as we acknowledge the prosaic origins of these mysteries, there remains something philosophically appropriate about their presence in worlds that are themselves defined by layers of meaning that exist independently of their creators' original intentions. The Dark Souls universe has become a space where players and theorists have discovered significance in details that were never intended to carry meaning. where the accidents of development have been transformed into clues for elaborate interpretive structures that extend far beyond anything that was consciously embedded in the original design. The Arabic inscriptions and modern debris serve as reminders that these worlds exist not only within their own fictional boundaries but also within our reality, as products of human creativity that bear the inevitable traces of their origins in our mundane, contemporary existence. They are scars that reveal the seams where fantasy and reality intersect, points where the carefully maintained illusion of a coherent alternate world briefly gives way to reveal the scaffolding of digital assets and borrowed textures that support the entire elaborate structure. But Archdragon Peak contains mysteries far more significant than misplaced textual elements or anachronistic refuse. Among the crumbling platforms and weathered statuary, there exists a figure whose presence raises questions that strike to the very heart of some of the Dark Souls universe's most enduring puzzles. Near the corpse of a mighty warrior, there stands a Havel knight, one of those rock-clad champions whose distinctive appearance has become iconic throughout the series, yet whose true nature and ultimate fate remain subjects of intense speculation and debate. Archbishop Havel the Rock stands as one of the most enigmatic figures in the entire Dark Souls pantheon, a character whose influence extends throughout multiple games despite his apparent absence from most of their actual events. Known as a close friend and ally of Lord Gwyn, Havel was renowned for his implacable opposition to magic in all its forms, a stance that put him in direct conflict with Seath the Scaleless, that albino dragon whose treachery had earned him a dukedom and whose magical research represented everything that Havel despised about the corruption of natural order through artificial means. The traditional account of Havel's fate suggests that he was found hollowed and imprisoned in a watchtower basement in Anor Londo, locked away by a dear friend who sought to protect both Havel and the world from the consequences of his madness. This interpretation, supported by item descriptions that speak of rumors regarding a fallen hero, paints a picture of tragic decline, of a great warrior whose noble purpose was eventually consumed by the same forces of despair and purposelessness that claimed so many others during the fading of the Age of Fire. Yet the presence of Havel Knights in locations far removed from Anor Londo, and particularly the discovery of such a figure at Archdragon Peak, suggests that the story of Havel's fate might be far more complex than this simple narrative of imprisonment and decline would suggest. The Havel Ring, that distinctive piece of equipment that bears his name and carries his blessing, is described as being worn by Havel's followers rather than by Havel himself, implying that there existed a broader movement or organization dedicated to his principles rather than merely a single individual whose personal fate determined the entire legacy. This distinction opens the possibility that the figure found imprisoned in the Watchtower was not Havel himself, but one of his devoted followers, someone who had taken on his identity and his mission so completely that they had become indistinguishable from their inspiration. The occult club found near the imprisoned figure suggests planning for some kind of action against the gods themselves, weapons specifically designed to be effective against divine beings, hidden away like tools prepared for a revolution that never came. The presence of a Havel Knight at Archdragon Peak, in close proximity to the Nameless king who was once Gwyn's firstborn and heir, suggests an entirely different narrative for Havel's ultimate fate. Perhaps the great Archbishop's opposition to Seath's magical research eventually expanded into a broader critique of the divine order that Gwyn had established, a recognition that the Lord of Sunlight's alliance with the scaleless dragon represented a fundamental betrayal of the principles that had originally justified the war against the ancient dragons. Under this interpretation, Havel's imprisonment might have been the result not of madness but of sedition, the consequence of his growing opposition to a system that he had once served faithfully but could no longer support in good conscience. His escape from confinement, whether through his own efforts or through the assistance of sympathetic followers, might have led him to seek out Gwyn's firstborn, that exiled god whose own break with the established order offered the possibility of alliance against the corruption that had consumed the divine hierarchy. The Ring of the Sun's Firstborn, found in Dark Souls 3, speaks of a god of war who was stripped of his divine status as punishment for his foolishness, his very name erased from the annals of history as though he had never existed. Yet this same figure appears to have found new purpose and identity as the Nameless King, the master of Archdragon Peak, who achieved reconciliation with the very dragons that his family had once warred against, forging alliances that would have seemed impossible during the height of the Age of Fire. The transformation of Gwyn's firstborn from Dragon Slayer to Dragon Ally represents one of the most profound character developments in the entire Dark Souls narrative, a journey from orthodox divine warrior to revolutionary exile that parallels similar transformations throughout the series. His presence at Archdragon Peak, surrounded by the remnants of draconic civilization and served by followers who have adopted the ways of the ancient dragons, suggests that his exile led not to despair but to enlightenment, a recognition that the war against the dragons had been based on false premises, and that true wisdom lay in learning from, rather than destroying the remnants of the primordial order. The name that this exiled god bore before his banishment remains a subject of intense speculation, as his punishment explicitly included the erasure of his identity from all records and remembrances. Yet certain clues scattered throughout the series suggest possible identities that might once have belonged to this forgotten deity. The Farum set, found in both Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, commemorates a war god whose domain included the Lion Knights of a distant land, warriors whose equipment bears dragon imagery that suggests complex relationships with the draconic powers that most of their contemporaries viewed as enemies. The war god wooden shield displays patterns that mark it as belonging to a mad god revered as a deity of warfare in remote regions, while its Dark Souls 2 counterpart, the Lion Clan shield, possessed religious significance related to gods whose identities were lost to history. These connections, while circumstantial, suggest that Farum might have been the original name of the god who became the Nameless King, a title that survived in distant lands even after its bearer's official erasure from the records of his homeland. Another possibility emerges from the examination of Sen's fortress, that elaborate proving ground whose name has always seemed oddly simple for such a significant location. The Japanese name translates more directly as Sen's Ancient Castle, suggesting that Sen was indeed a proper name rather than a numeric reference. The fortress itself serves as a testing ground for those who would approach Anor Londo, filled with traps and challenges that separate the worthy from the merely ambitious, a function that would be entirely appropriate for a structure built and maintained by a god of war. The architectural similarities between elements found in Sen's fortress and those discovered in the Duke's archives, particularly the distinctive crossbow mechanisms and decorative patterns, suggest that the fortress might have been constructed by the same craftsman responsible for Seath's weapons, or at least by someone working within the same artistic tradition. The presence of silver knight statues throughout the fortress, combined with the lightning spear dropped by one of its mimics, creates connections to the divine hierarchy that ruled from Anor Londo during the height of the Age of Fire. Most intriguingly, the placement of Ricard's rapier in both Sen's fortress and Archdragon Peak creates a direct link between these locations that seems too specific to be coincidental. This weapon, associated with a knight whose identity remains mysterious but whose skill was clearly considerable, suggests that there were individuals who moved between these locations who served both the master of the ancient fortress and the exiled king who found new purpose among the dragons. Yet even as we explore these connections between Sen's Fortress and Archdragon Peak, between the unnamed war god and the testing ground that bears a forgotten name, we encounter another mystery that complicates our understanding of the relationships between different locations and time periods within the Dark Souls universe. The sky above Archdragon Peak blazes with brilliant sunlight, a stark contrast to the dark, ash-laden atmosphere that characterizes most of Lothric during the events of Dark Souls 3. This dramatic difference in atmospheric conditions cannot be easily dismissed as mere aesthetic choice or artistic license. Throughout the Dark Souls series, environmental details carry significant narrative weight, serving as visual metaphors for deeper truths about the nature of the locations they characterize. The perpetual twilight that shrouds most of Lothric speaks to the kingdom's position in the final phase of the Age of Fire, a realm where the light is literally dying and the shadows grow longer with each passing moment. The brilliant daylight that illuminates Archdragon Peak therefore demands explanation, suggesting that this location operates according to different rules or exists in a different temporal framework than the surrounding world. One possibility is that the peak exists in a state of temporal displacement, a location that has been somehow removed from the normal flow of time and preserved in an earlier era when the sun still burned with full intensity and the Age of Fire had not yet entered its final decline. This theory gains support from the examination of another location that appears to exist outside the normal temporal framework of Dark Souls 3, the Untended Graves. That dark reflection of the Cemetery of Ash, where the Ashen One first awakened. The graves present a version of the familiar starting location shrouded in perpetual darkness, populated by different enemies, and presided over by Champion Gundyr, rather than his role as Iodex Gundyr, the judge who tests the worthiness of those who would claim the title of Ashen One. The relationship between these two versions of the same location has generated extensive speculation about the nature of time and causality within the Dark Souls universe. The most straightforward interpretation suggests that the untended graves represent the Cemetery of Ash as it existed in the past, during a period before the fire was successfully linked and the light returned to drive back the encroaching darkness. Under this reading, the Ashen One's journey to the untended graves constitutes a form of time travel, a venture into earlier events that helps explain the present circumstances they encounter. Champion Gundyr's presence in the untended graves, combined with his description as a champion who arrived too late to fulfill his destiny, supports this temporal interpretation. His armor set speaks of a belated champion who was bested by an unknown warrior and subsequently became sheathed to a coiled sword in the hopes that someday the first flame might be linked once more. The coiled sword that impales him in the untended graves must be removed for the battle to begin, suggesting that this weapon serves as both prison and preservation, keeping him in a state of suspended animation until the proper time for his awakening. The identity of the unknown warrior who defeated Champion Gundyr becomes a crucial element in understanding the temporal relationships between different versions of events. If the untended graves truly represent the past, then the Ashen One's victory over Champion Gundyr might constitute the very event that the champion's item descriptions reference, creating a closed temporal loop where the player's actions in the present create the past events that make their current situation possible. This interpretation receives additional support from the presence of the Shrine Handmaid in both the Untended Graves and Firelink Shrine, where she demonstrates apparent recognition of the Ashen One if encountered first in the darker location. Her dialogue suggests memory of previous interactions, a continuity of experience that spans the temporal displacement between the two versions of these interconnected areas. The rare items she sells, including the hidden blessing that can also be found in the untended graves, suggest that her inventory reflects her experiences across multiple time periods. Yet the temporal displacement theory, while elegant in its explanation of the darker areas, faces complications when extended to Archdragon Peak and its brilliant daylight. If both the untended graves and Archdragon Peak represent excursions into earlier time periods, we would expect them to share similar atmospheric characteristics, both showing the world as it existed before the current crisis reached its full development. Instead, we encounter radically different environmental conditions that suggest these locations might operate according to entirely different principles. An alternative explanation for Archdragon Peak's unusual brightness draws on the extensive use of illusion magic throughout the Dark Souls series, particularly the elaborate deceptions created by Gwendolyn in Anor Londo. The Dark Sun's power extended far beyond simple visual tricks to encompass comprehensive alterations of perceived reality, creating false environments that could fool even experienced observers into believing they inhabited locations that existed only in the illusionist's imagination. The perpetual daylight that bathes Anor Londo during the player's first visit serves as perhaps the most famous example of such deception. When Gwendolyn's illusions are finally dispelled, the Silver City reveals its true state of decline and abandonment, its false sun extinguished to reveal the darkness that had always lurked beneath the artificial brightness. The sudden transformation from magnificent divine city to crumbling ruin demonstrates the extent to which illusory magic could mask fundamental truths about the nature of reality. If the Nameless King possessed similar abilities to create and maintain large-scale illusions, then the brilliant daylight of Archdragon Peak might represent another such deception, a false environment designed to create the impression of continued vitality and purpose in a world that was actually subject to the same decay that affected all other locations. The sound that accompanies the player's transportation to the peak, often interpreted as the cry of the wyvern that carries them to their destination, might instead represent the activation of an elaborate illusion that transforms their perception of their surroundings. This theory would explain why the peak's daylight persists even after the Nameless King's defeat. Unlike the situation in Anor Londo, where Gwendolyn's death led to the immediate dissolution of his deceptions, perhaps the illusory environment of Archdragon Peak was designed to be self-maintaining, powered by forces that transcend the presence or absence of its original creator, or perhaps the Nameless King's mastery of such magic exceeded even his half-brother's considerable abilities in this area. Yet another possibility emerges when we consider the connections between Archdragon Peak and the Consumed King's Garden, that twisted realm where Osiros pursued his obsession with dragons through increasingly desperate and morally questionable means. The garden serves as the gateway to the untended graves, accessed through an illusory wall that conceals the path to the darker reflection of familiar locations. This architectural connection suggests that the garden might serve as a kind of hub, a location where different temporal streams or alternate realities intersect and become accessible to those who know the proper methods for navigating between them. Osiros himself represents a figure whose transformation mirrors, in some ways, the journey undertaken by the Nameless King. Both were members of the royal hierarchy, who became obsessed with dragons and sought to transcend their original nature through identification with draconic powers. The crucial difference lies in their ultimate fates, where the Nameless King achieved genuine alliance and mutual respect with the ancient dragons. Osiros became a monstrosity, consumed by his obsessions and transformed into a creature that embodied the worst aspects of both human ambition and draconic power. The path of the dragon gesture, required to access Archdragon Peak, is found within the Consumed King's Garden, creating a direct connection between Oshiros's failed transformation and the successful integration achieved by the community that worships at the peak. This placement suggests that the garden serves as a kind of staging area, a location where different approaches to dragon-human relationships can be observed and evaluated before the seeker commits to a particular path of development. The serpent men that populate both locations provide another link between the consumed King's Garden and Archdragon Peak. Creatures whose forms combine human and reptilian characteristics in ways that suggest incomplete or corrupted attempts to achieve the dragon transformation that represents the ultimate goal of the path. These beings serve as warnings, examples of what can go wrong when the desire for transcendence exceeds the wisdom and preparation necessary to achieve it safely. Yet even as we explore these various connections between locations and transformations, between illusions and temporal displacements, we must acknowledge that the true mystery of Archdragon Peak might lie not in any single explanation, but in its function as a space where multiple interpretations can coexist without contradiction. The peak serves as a location where the boundaries between past and present, reality and illusion, success and failure, have become so blurred that definitive answers become less important than the questions themselves. The brilliant daylight that bathes the peak might simultaneously be an illusion maintained by divine power, a temporal anomaly that preserves an earlier era, and a genuine manifestation of hope and renewal in a world that has largely forgotten such possibilities. The presence of the Nameless King might represent both exile and homecoming, both punishment and reward, both ending and beginning, depending on the perspective from which his journey is evaluated. This multiplicity of meaning reflects a broader characteristic of the Dark Souls universe, where the accumulated weight of countless cycles and the distortions created by artificial prolongation of natural processes have created spaces where normal logical categories begin to break down. Archdragon Peak stands as perhaps the most perfect example of such a space, a location where pilgrims can encounter the divine, the temporal, the illusory, and the transcendent, all within the same architectural framework. The devotees who make their way to this elevated shrine do not come seeking simple answers or straightforward revelations. They arrive already understanding that the mysteries they hope to encounter will be more complex and more paradoxical than anything that could be resolved through conventional analysis. The peak rewards such sophistication by offering experiences that operate on multiple levels simultaneously, providing different truths to different seekers based on their capacity for understanding and their willingness to embrace ambiguity as a form of wisdom. As we prepare to descend from these lofty heights and explore other regions of these interconnected worlds, we carry with us the lessons learned from contemplating the mysteries of Archdragon Peak. We have discovered that the most profound truths often resist simple categorization, that the boundaries between different states of existence are more fluid than they initially appear, and that the accumulation of contradictory evidence might point not to confusion but to realities that transcend the limitations of ordinary logical frameworks. The peak stands as a monument to the possibility that exile might become homecoming, that endings might serve as beginnings, and that the most complete victories might emerge from the most apparent defeats. These paradoxes will serve us well as we venture into territories where similar principles operate, where the familiar categories of identity and purpose, loyalty and betrayal, success and failure, reveal themselves to be far more complex and interpenetrated than conventional wisdom would suggest. In the shadowed corners of existence, where the boundaries between hunter and hunted blur into indistinction, there move figures whose very presence transforms the nature of the spaces they inhabit. These are beings driven by purposes that transcend ordinary motivation, creatures whose dedication to their chosen tasks has elevated them beyond the normal limitations of individual identity and personal desire. They exist as forces of nature given form, embodiments of principles so fundamental to the operation of their worlds that they seem less like characters in a narrative and more like manifestations of the underlying rules that govern reality itself. Among the most relentless of these figures is a presence that has haunted the cursed lands of Drangleic since the earliest days of the bearer of the curse's journey through that realm of fading memory and accumulated sorrow. The pursuer appears without warning, materializes from shadows and mists with the inevitability of gravity or the passage of time, driven by a compulsion so absolute that neither death nor defeat can deter it from its chosen mission. This armored figure moves through the world with mechanical precision, its every action focused on a single, unwavering goal: the elimination of those who bear the dark sign, the mark that identifies the undead and sets them apart from the normal flow of life and death. The pursuer's dedication to this task approaches the sublime in its purity. There is no negotiation possible with this entity, no appeal to mercy or reason that might deflect it from its purpose. It exists solely to hunt, to track, to corner, and ultimately to destroy those unfortunate enough to attract its attention. Even death provides no permanent respite from its attentions, for the pursuer possesses a relationship with mortality that allows it to return again and again, each defeat serving merely as a temporary setback in a campaign that spans far longer than any individual lifetime. The mystery that surrounds this relentless hunter extends far beyond the simple question of its identity or origins. The pursuer's very nature seems to challenge conventional understanding of what it means to be an individual entity with a coherent identity. Its appearances throughout Drangleic follow patterns that suggest something more complex than a single being moving from location to location in pursuit of its quarry. The creature manifests in multiple places simultaneously, appears to possess knowledge of the bearer of the curse's movements that exceeds what any ordinary tracking ability could provide, and demonstrates a persistence that suggests access to resources and capabilities far beyond those of normal, mortal, or even supernatural entities. The soul that the pursuer drops upon its defeat provides crucial insights into its true nature, though these insights raise more questions than they answer. The item description speaks not of a singular entity, but of one who seeks bearers of the sign, implying that the pursuit of the cursed is not merely a personal obsession, but a professional calling, a role that might be filled by different individuals at different times. The Ultra Greatsword associated with the pursuer reinforces this interpretation, describing a weapon wielded by one who hunts down those branded by the curse, as though each undead soul claimed will atone for sins of unimaginable magnitude. This reference to atonement introduces a moral dimension to the pursuer's activities that complicates any simple interpretation of its role as mere antagonist or obstacle. The suggestion that the hunting and destruction of the undead serves as a form of penance implies that the pursuer operates within a framework of cosmic justice, executing judgments that serve purposes larger than mere personal vendetta or arbitrary cruelty. The undead curse that marks its targets is not merely a supernatural affliction, but a sign of transgression, a brand that identifies those who have somehow violated the natural order and must be eliminated to restore balance to the world. Yet, this interpretation faces immediate challenges when subjected to closer examination. The bearer of the curse, who serves as the primary target of the pursuer's attention, displays none of the obvious moral failings that would justify such relentless persecution. Indeed, the bearer's journey through Drangleic is characterized by acts of heroism and self-sacrifice, by a willingness to face seemingly impossible challenges in service of goals that extend far beyond personal gain or satisfaction. If the dark sign truly marks its bearers as sinners deserving of divine punishment, then the cosmic justice system it represents appears to operate according to principles that bear no resemblance to conventional morality. The revelation that multiple pursuers can appear simultaneously during New Game Plus cycles provides crucial evidence for understanding the true nature of these entities. Rather than representing a single individual whose dedication allows for seemingly impossible feats of ubiquity and persistence, the pursuer appears to be a role or office that can be filled by multiple entities operating in coordination toward shared objectives. This interpretation transforms our understanding of the creature from that of a unique antagonist to that of a representative of a larger organization or system dedicated to the maintenance of cosmic order through the elimination of those who threaten it. The Japanese translation of the pursuer's name reinforces this institutional interpretation, referring not to a specific hunter, but to cursed ones, implying a category of beings rather than a unique individual. This linguistic evidence suggests that what players encounter as the pursuer is actually one member of a larger group, all of whom share similar purposes and methods, but who operate as distinct entities rather than manifestations of a single consciousness. The cursed nature, referenced in this translation, implies that these hunters are themselves afflicted by supernatural forces, bound to their task not by choice, but by compulsions that override their individual wills and desires. The concept of curse-bound knights driven to hunt the undead by forces beyond their control introduces tragic dimensions to figures that might otherwise be dismissed as simple antagonists. These beings become victims as well as perpetrators, entities whose original identities and purposes have been subsumed by supernatural compulsions that transform them into instruments of cosmic correction. The armor that encases them serves not merely as protection but as prison, containing spirits and entities that writhe beneath its surface in eternal agony, while being forced to carry out actions that their original natures might find abhorrent. This interpretation receives support from artistic descriptions of the pursuer that speak of cursed spirits permeating the creature's entire being, malevolent entities that squirm beneath its armor in constant attempts to break free from their confinement. These spirits represent the accumulated grudges and resentments of those who have been pursued and destroyed, their deaths serving not as endings, but as additions to the supernatural forces that drive the hunter's continued existence. Each victory achieved by the pursuer adds new layers to its curse, new voices to the chorus of malice that motivates its relentless hunt. Under this reading, the pursuer becomes a tragic figure trapped in a cycle of violence that grows more terrible with each iteration. The souls it claims in service of its supposed atonement serve only to deepen its curse, to add new sources of compulsion that make escape from its role increasingly impossible. The entity that began as a knight seeking to serve some form of cosmic justice becomes gradually transformed into a monster whose existence depends on the continuation of the very evil it originally sought to eliminate. Yet, even as we contemplate the tragic dimensions of the pursuer's existence, we must acknowledge that this figure represents only one example of the complex relationships between hunter and hunted that characterize the Dark Souls universe. Throughout these interconnected worlds, there exist beings whose dedication to particular individuals or causes has elevated them beyond ordinary categories of loyalty and devotion, creatures whose very existence seems to depend on the continuation of their chosen pursuits, regardless of the personal costs such dedication might exact. In the ancient halls of Lordran, during the Golden Age, when the gods walked among mortals and the silver city of Anor Londo gleamed with divine radiance, there moved a figure whose scholarly pursuits and magnificent headwear had made him a legend among those who valued knowledge above all other treasures. Big Hat Logan, represented the apex of sorcerous achievement, a master whose understanding of magical principles exceeded that of almost every other practitioner. In an age when magic still flowed freely through the world and the boundaries between the possible and impossible had not yet hardened into their later, more restrictive forms, Logan's reputation extended far beyond mere technical proficiency in the manipulation of magical forces. His legendary status derived from his insatiable curiosity, his willingness to venture into dangerous territories and forbidden areas in pursuit of knowledge that others feared to seek. The magnificent hat that gave him his common name served as both practical equipment and symbolic statement, a piece of headwear so distinctive and impressive that it became synonymous with magical excellence throughout the known world. Yet Logan's pursuit of knowledge came at costs that extended beyond the obvious dangers of venturing into hostile territories or experimenting with forces that could easily destroy those who lacked sufficient skill to control them. His dedication to his studies had isolated him from normal social relationships, transformed him into a figure who existed primarily in relation to his magical research, rather than as a member of any community or tradition that might provide stability and support for his endeavors. This isolation made him simultaneously admirable for his single-minded dedication and pitiable for his disconnection from the broader human context that gives meaning to individual achievement. The name Logan, when examined through its etymological roots in Scottish Gaelic, reveals meanings that add layers of irony to his character. The translation, Little Hollow, creates a linguistic pun that connects the great sorcerer to the very condition that represents the ultimate fate of those who lose their purpose and allow despair to consume their essential nature. This connection suggests that Logan's magnificent achievements in the realm of magical knowledge exist in tension with a fundamental emptiness at the core of his being, a void that no amount of learning can adequately fill. This emptiness becomes particularly poignant when we consider Logan's relationship with those who seek to follow in his footsteps, particularly the devoted student who shadows his movements through the dangerous territories of Lordran with a persistence that borders on obsession. Griggs of Vinheim presents himself as a straightforward admirer, seeking education from a master whose reputation has inspired him to risk everything in pursuit of the opportunity to learn from the greatest sorcerer of the age. Yet the nature of Griggs's devotion, combined with certain suspicious elements in his background and equipment, raises questions about his true motivations that transform what might seem like a simple student-teacher relationship into something far more complex and potentially sinister. Griggs's claim that his search for Logan represents his own conceit introduces ambiguities that resist simple interpretation. Conceit can refer to excessive pride in one's own abilities, suggesting that Griggs seeks Logan not out of humble desire to learn, but from arrogant belief that he deserves the master's attention and instruction. This interpretation casts Griggs as a figure whose apparent devotion masks deeper currents of ego and ambition, someone who views Logan not as a teacher to be revered, but as a stepping stone toward his own advancement in the hierarchy of magical practitioners. Alternatively, conceit can refer to elaborate metaphors or fanciful constructions that exist primarily in the imagination rather than in objective reality. Under this reading, Griggs's admission takes on far more ominous implications, suggesting that his entire quest to find Logan serves as a cover story designed to conceal his true purposes and activities. The devoted student becomes a fabricated identity maintained for the benefit of those who might question his presence in dangerous territories or his knowledge of Logan's movements and activities. This interpretation receives support from careful examination of Griggs's equipment and affiliations, details that reveal connections to institutions and practices that sit uncomfortably with his stated role as devoted student. The black sorcerer set that he wears is described as belonging to secret sorcerers at Vinheim Dragon School, practitioners who work with forbidden magical techniques and maintain their anonymity through elaborate precautions designed to prevent their identification by those who might wish them harm. The slumbering dragon crest ring that Griggs carries serves a similar function, masking all sound emanating from its wearer to allow for completely silent movement through potentially hostile environments. These pieces of equipment mark Griggs as someone whose true activities require secrecy and stealth, capabilities that seem far beyond what any ordinary student would need for legitimate educational pursuits. The emphasis on concealment and silent movement suggests preparation for activities that would be dangerous not because of external threats, but because of their potential consequences if discovered by authorities or rivals who might disapprove of the practitioner's methods or objectives. The presence of another sorcerer's corpse in the barrel-filled room where Griggs is first encountered adds another layer of mystery to his circumstances and background. The dead sorcerer serves as either warning or evidence, a reminder that the practice of forbidden magical arts carries risks that extend beyond the technical challenges of manipulating dangerous forces. The fact that Griggs survived while his colleague did not raise questions about the circumstances that led to this situation and the reasons why one sorcerer might have been eliminated while another was merely imprisoned. The possibility that Griggs serves as a spy or assassin sent by Vinheim Dragon School to monitor or eliminate Logan gains credibility when we consider the broader context of magical politics during the Age of Fire. Vinheim appears to have been a center of sorcerous learning that maintained its position through careful control of magical knowledge and the practitioners who possessed it. The school's emphasis on secrecy and its production of assassins alongside scholars suggests an institution that viewed knowledge as a strategic resource requiring protection from those who might misuse it or share it inappropriately. With outsiders, Logan's legendary status and independent research activities would naturally attract attention from such an institution, particularly if his discoveries threatened to undermine the school's control over magical knowledge or revealed secrets that the authorities preferred to keep hidden. His willingness to venture into dangerous territories and experiment with forbidden techniques marked him as exactly the sort of practitioner who might need to be monitored, controlled, or ultimately eliminated if his activities grew too dangerous or his influence too extensive. The timing of Griggs's appearance in Logan's story supports this interpretation of his role as institutional agent rather than genuine student. Griggs consistently arrives in locations shortly before or after Logan, demonstrating knowledge of the Master's movements that exceeds what casual admiration or coincidental encounter could explain. His ability to track Logan through dangerous territories like Sen's fortress suggests access to information sources and resources that go far beyond what an individual student could reasonably possess. Yet even as we explore these darker interpretations of Griggs's motivations and activities, we must acknowledge alternative possibilities that cast his devotion in a more sympathetic light. The revelation from Orbeck of Vinheim in Dark Souls 3 that Logan was well loved and respected in his homeland complicates any simple narrative of institutional persecution or elimination. If Logan truly enjoyed official approval and support from the magical authorities, then Griggs's mission might have been protective rather than elimination, designed to ensure the Master's safety during his dangerous researches rather than to silence him permanently. Under this interpretation, Griggs becomes a guardian angel of sorts, a figure whose genuine admiration for Logan motivated him to accept dangerous assignments that would allow him to provide assistance and protection while maintaining the pretense of being merely another student seeking education. The secretive equipment and institutional connections that mark him as potentially dangerous could equally well serve defensive purposes, allowing him to respond effectively to threats against Logan, while maintaining cover identities that would not compromise either his mission or his target's independence. The complexity of Griggs's character reflects broader themes that run throughout the Dark Souls universe, where simple categories of loyalty and betrayal, protection and persecution, education and manipulation prove inadequate for understanding the full range of relationships that exist between characters whose individual motivations remain partially hidden even from themselves. The possibility that Griggs simultaneously serves as both devoted student and institutional agent, both protector and potential threat, both genuine admirer and professional spy, demonstrates how the deteriorating conditions of the Age of Fire have created situations where traditional moral categories become insufficient for navigating the ethical complexities that define human relationships. The ambiguity that surrounds Griggs's true purpose serves as preparation for understanding similar figures who appear throughout the series, beings whose apparent devotion to particular individuals or causes masks deeper currents of institutional affiliation, personal ambition, or professional obligation that complicate any simple interpretation of their roles and motivations. These characters challenge players and theorists to look beyond surface appearances and stated intentions, to consider the possibility that even the most apparently straightforward relationships might conceal layers of meaning that transform devotion into manipulation, protection into persecution, and education into elimination. The figure of the devoted follower whose true purposes remain suspect becomes a recurring motif throughout the Dark Souls universe, appearing in various forms and contexts, but always raising similar questions about the nature of loyalty, the reliability of stated motivations, and the extent to which individual relationships can transcend the institutional and political pressures that shape the broader context within which they exist. These characters serve as reminders that in worlds where the fundamental structures of reality have become unreliable, even the most basic human connections must be subjected to careful scrutiny and critical evaluation. As we prepare to venture deeper into the mysteries that surround other forms of pursuit and devotion, other relationships between hunters and hunted, followers and leaders, students and masters, we carry with us the lessons learned from contemplating figures like the Pursuer and Griggs. We have discovered that dedication can become a curse, that admiration can mask surveillance, and that even the most apparently straightforward motivations might conceal complexities that transform our understanding of the characters who embody them. The bell that signals our transition to new territories rings with echoes of these insights, reminding us that the relationships we encounter in painted worlds and hidden sanctuaries will require similar careful attention to the gaps between appearance and reality, between stated purpose and hidden motivation, between the roles that characters claim to fulfill and the functions they actually serve within the larger narratives that contain them. In the liminal spaces that exist between the solid certainties of stone and steel, between the harsh realities of kingdoms built upon conquest and the gentle possibilities of refuge constructed from compassion, there have always existed realms where different rules apply, where the outcasts and the forgotten might find sanctuary from the relentless machinery of power that grinds so many lives into dust and memory. These painted worlds, born from the marriage of artistic vision and desperate need, serve as more than mere escapes from the troubles of ordinary existence. They represent fundamental challenges to the assumption that reality must always conform to the harsh logic of survival and domination. The journey that leads to these sanctuaries of the exiled begins not with conscious choice, but with the recognition that the world, as it exists, has become incompatible with certain forms of life. certain ways of being that cannot flourish under the conditions that others accept as natural and inevitable. The path to the painted realm opens only to those who carry within themselves the understanding that what appears to be the totality of existence might in fact be merely one possible arrangement among many, and that alternative configurations might offer hope to those who have found themselves unable to thrive within the established order. Yet, the road to such sanctuaries is neither simple nor without its own forms of tragedy and loss. The very forces that make painted worlds necessary as refuges for the unwanted and the dangerous also ensure that the journey to reach them will be marked by sacrifice, corruption, and the kind of moral complexity that transforms heroes into cautionary tales and noble intentions into sources of profound regret. The story of how these realms come to exist, and of those who venture into them seeking either sanctuary or conquest, reveals truths about the nature of heroism and failure that resist easy categorization. Among the most tragic figures in this narrative stands Artorias the Abyss Walker, that legendary knight, whose very name once served as synonymous with heroic virtue and unwavering dedication to the protection of the innocent. His reputation had been forged through countless battles against the forces of darkness, through his willingness to venture into territories where other warriors feared to tread, and through his absolute commitment to the principles that defined the Age of Fire at its most noble and inspiring. The great sword that he carried and the wolf companion who fought beside him had become symbols recognized throughout the realm, representations of hope that suggested even the most terrible threats could be overcome through sufficient courage and determination. When reports reached Anor Londo of a spreading corruption that threatened to consume entire territories, transforming thriving communities into nightmarish landscapes where sanity itself became a casualty of exposure to forces that operated according to principles fundamentally hostile to life, as it was commonly understood, Artorias responded with the same unflinching bravery that had characterized all of his previous interventions. The abyss that had begun to spread outward from the ancient land of Ulasil represented a form of darkness that transcended mere absence of light, a negation of meaning and order, so complete that it transformed everything it touched into grotesque parodies of their original forms. The scholarly community of Ulasil, known throughout the land for its dedication to magical research and its attempts to understand the deeper mysteries of existence, had made the fatal error of disturbing forces that were better left undisturbed. Their excavation of the grave of Manus, that primeval human whose rest had been maintained for ages beyond counting, had awakened something whose fury and madness exceeded anything that their considerable learning had prepared them to handle. The transformation of Manus into the Father of the Abyss created a source of corruption that spread outward like a plague, consuming not just individual lives but the very concepts of identity and meaning that made coherent existence possible. Artorias approached this unprecedented threat with careful preparation and clear understanding of the dangers he would face. The covenant he forged with the creatures of the abyss represented not compromise with evil but strategic adaptation to circumstances that demanded unconventional responses. The ring that symbolized this agreement granted him the ability to traverse the corrupted landscape without being immediately destroyed by its influence. But it also created a connection between his own essence and the very forces he sought to combat, a link that would prove to be both his salvation and his doom. The battles that Artorias fought within the depths of the corrupted Ulasil tested not only his martial prowess, but his fundamental capacity to maintain his sense of self, while surrounded by forces that actively sought to unmake the basic categories of thought and identity. The abyss was not merely a dangerous environment, but an active assault on the concept of individual existence, a force that sought to dissolve the boundaries that separated one being from another, and reduce all consciousness to a uniform soup of undifferentiated suffering. For a time, it seemed that Artorias might achieve what no other warrior had even attempted: the single-handed defeat of a cosmic force that threatened to undo the basic structure of reality itself. His great sword carved through the creatures of darkness like lightning through storm clouds, and his presence seemed to create islands of stability within the chaos that surrounded him. Sif, his loyal wolf companion, fought beside him with the fierce dedication that had always characterized their partnership, her fangs and claws proving effective, even against enemies that seemed to exist only partially within the physical realm. But the abyss possessed a patience that exceeded human understanding, and a malevolence that could wait for weakness to reveal itself in even the most disciplined and prepared opponents. The constant exposure to its corrupting influence began to wear away at Artorias' mental defenses like water slowly eroding stone, creating tiny cracks in his psychological armor that gradually widened under the relentless pressure of sustained contact with forces that existed in fundamental opposition to everything he represented. The ring that allowed him to traverse the abyss also served as a conduit through which its influence could reach into his soul, creating a gradual transformation that was all the more terrible for its subtlety. Rather than overwhelming him through direct assault, the darkness worked by degrees, slowly altering his perceptions and motivations in ways that he might not notice until the changes had progressed beyond the point where they could be reversed through mere effort of will. The signs of his corruption manifested first in his fighting style, as the precision and control that had always characterized his sword work gave way to increasingly wild and undisciplined attacks. The great sword that had once moved like an extension of his own body began to strike with mindless fury, its blade falling upon friend and foe alike, without the discrimination that had once marked him as a true master of martial arts. More troubling still was the gradual erosion of the very qualities that had made him a hero: his compassion for the innocent, his wisdom in choosing when to fight and when to seek alternative solutions, his unwavering commitment to protecting others even at the cost of his own safety and well-being. Recognizing that his corruption was advancing beyond his ability to control or reverse, Artorias made one final gesture that demonstrated the nobility that still existed at his core, despite the changes that had consumed so much of his essential nature. Using the last remnants of his uncorrupted will, he erected a protective barrier around Sif, ensuring that his loyal companion would survive even if he himself fell completely to the darkness that threatened to consume him. This act of selfless love, performed at the moment when his own transformation was reaching its irreversible conclusion, represented perhaps the most heroic thing he had ever done, a final affirmation of the values he had served, even as those values became impossible for him to continue embodying. The fall of Artorias, from legendary hero to corrupted champion, represented more than merely the loss of a great warrior. It symbolized the fundamental vulnerability that characterized even the most noble aspects of the Age of Fire. When confronted with forces that operated according to entirely different principles, if someone as pure and dedicated as the Abyss Walker could be transformed into an agent of the very darkness he had sworn to combat, what hope existed for lesser beings who lacked his strength, his training, and his absolute commitment to righteous principles? Yet even as the truth of Artorias' fate became known to the few who possessed the knowledge and the courage to venture into the corrupted depths of Ulasil, a very different version of his story began to spread throughout the broader world. The legends that emerged from his final campaign spoke not of corruption and tragic failure, but of ultimate triumph, of a hero who had single-handedly defeated the Father of the Abyss and saved the world from a fate worse than death. These tales, while false in their specific details, served important functions in maintaining the morale and hope of populations that faced their own struggles against forces that seemed impossible to overcome. The transformation of Artorias, from tragic victim to legendary victor in the popular imagination, demonstrates how the needs of society can reshape historical truth, creating narratives that serve psychological and political functions that transcend mere accuracy. The people of the realm needed heroes whose stories ended in victory, champions whose sacrifices produced meaningful results, rather than merely postponing inevitable doom. The false legend of Artorias provided exactly such a narrative, offering evidence that evil could be defeated through sufficient courage and determination, even when the reality of his fate suggested far more troubling conclusions about the nature of heroism in a world where fundamental forces operated in opposition to human flourishing. This process of mythologization reveals how the painted worlds that serve as refuges for the exiled and the forgotten also function as repositories for truths too complex or disturbing to be comfortably integrated into mainstream narratives. The real Artorias, corrupted and transformed into an agent of the forces he had sought to destroy, found his final resting place, not in the heroic narratives of the outside world, but in the hidden depths accessible only to those willing to confront uncomfortable realities about the costs of heroism and the limitations of individual virtue when faced with cosmic-scale threats. The painted world that eventually contained the memory of Artorias' true fate was not created initially as a sanctuary for fallen heroes or a repository for suppressed historical truths. The original painted world of Ariandel emerged from entirely different circumstances, born from the vision of an artist whose understanding of beauty and meaning transcended the conventional boundaries that separated different forms of existence. Ariandel created her world as a haven for those who had been deemed dangerous or undesirable by the authorities of the established order, beings whose very existence posed challenges to the stability and consistency that those in power required for the maintenance of their control. The world that Ariandel painted was characterized not by the harsh landscapes and brutal conflicts that defined most of the known realm, but by gentle snowfall and quiet beauty, by architecture that seemed to grow organically from the desires and needs of its inhabitants, rather than being imposed upon them by external authorities with their own agendas. This was a place where the rules that governed ordinary existence could be suspended or modified, where those who had been branded as monsters or outcasts could find not only safety, but the possibility of genuine peace. Yet even this sanctuary, created with the most benevolent of intentions, could not entirely escape the tragic patterns that seemed to characterize all attempts to create alternatives to the established order. The painted world's separation from the broader realm that surrounded it, while necessary for the protection of its inhabitants, also created conditions of isolation that carried their own forms of suffering and limitation. Those who found refuge within its boundaries gained safety at the cost of connection to the larger world that had rejected them, creating a form of gentle imprisonment that was more humane than outright persecution, but still represented a fundamental restriction on the possibilities available to those it sheltered. The crossbreed Priscilla, who served as the painted world's most notable resident and its unofficial guardian, embodied both the sanctuary's potential for nurturing those who could not thrive elsewhere and its inherent limitations as a solution to the problems that made such refuges necessary. Her nature as a being who combined human and dragon characteristics marked her as fundamentally incompatible with the established order of the Age of Fire, a creature whose very existence challenged the categories and distinctions upon which that order depended for its coherence and stability. Priscilla's exile to the painted world represented not punishment for crimes she had committed, but preemptive action against threats she might pose, simply by existing in a realm that had no conceptual framework for accommodating beings like her. The gods who ordered her confinement acted not from cruelty, but from a form of systematic thinking that required clear boundaries between different types of existence, categories that could be maintained only through the exclusion of entities that defied easy classification. The power of life hunt that Priscilla possessed, her ability to drain the very essence of life from other beings, represented exactly the kind of capability that the authorities of the Age of Fire found most threatening. This was not merely a dangerous weapon that could be controlled through proper regulation, but a fundamental challenge to the assumption that the gods possessed ultimate authority over life and death. Priscilla's abilities suggested the existence of forces that operated independently of divine will, powers that could not be contained or controlled through the conventional methods that had proven effective in maintaining order throughout the realm. Yet Priscilla herself showed no inclination toward using her powers for conquest or destruction, no desire to challenge the authorities that had exiled her, or to seek revenge against those who had deemed her too dangerous to remain free. Her acceptance of her confinement within the painted world, her willingness to serve as its guardian and protector rather than its prisoner, demonstrated a nobility of character that made her exile seem not only unjust but actively counterproductive to the cause of maintaining peace and stability throughout the realm. The tragic irony of Priscilla's situation lay in the recognition that her voluntary acceptance of exile represented exactly the kind of wisdom and restraint that the authorities claimed to value. Yet her possession of dangerous abilities meant that these very virtues could not be trusted to continue indefinitely. The system that had exiled her operated according to principles that valued control over character, capability over intention, the elimination of potential threats over the cultivation of actual virtue. Under such a system, even the most noble and restrained individuals could be treated as enemies if their mere existence posed challenges to established categories and power structures. The painted world of Ariandel thus served multiple functions simultaneously. It was genuinely a sanctuary for those who needed protection from persecution, a prison for those deemed too dangerous to remain free, and a testament to the fundamental limitations of any system that sought to maintain order through the exclusion and control of problematic elements. The world's beauty and peace were real and meaningful, but they existed within boundaries that were themselves forms of limitation and control, creating a complex moral situation that resisted simple evaluation as either success or failure. This complexity deepened considerably with the passage of time and the emergence of new painted worlds that built upon the foundation established by Ariandel, while adapting to changed circumstances and different needs. The painted world of Ariandel, encountered during the final phase of the Age of Fire, represented both continuity with and departure from the original vision that had created the first sanctuary for the exiled and unwanted, where Ariandel had painted her world as a permanent refuge, a place where outcasts could find lasting peace and safety. Ariandel was conceived as part of a cyclical process, a realm that would periodically undergo renewal through controlled destruction and recreation. Father Ariandel, the figure who gave his name to this second iteration of the painted world, approached the challenge of maintaining such a sanctuary through methods that differed significantly from those employed by his predecessor. Rather than attempting to create permanent stability, he recognized that all things were subject to decay and corruption over time, and that the preservation of the world's essential character required periodic renewal through what he termed the cleansing flame. The use of his own blood as paint, as a medium through which the world's renewal could be achieved, represented both profound sacrifice and practical necessity. The painted world required constant attention and maintenance to prevent the rot and corruption that naturally accumulated over time from destroying its essential character and transforming it from sanctuary into something indistinguishable from the harsh realities it was meant to provide escape from. Ariandel's blood served as both artistic medium and preservative agent, a substance that could maintain the world's integrity while requiring enormous personal cost from the one who provided it. Yet this system of maintenance through blood sacrifice created its own problems and limitations, transforming what had been conceived as renewal into a form of stagnation that prevented genuine change while preserving only the superficial appearance of vitality. The world maintained by Ariandel's blood was indeed protected from decay and corruption, but it was also prevented from growing and developing in response to the changing needs of its inhabitants. The result was a form of artificial preservation that created the illusion of life while actually preventing the kind of organic change and development that characterized genuine living systems. Sister Friday, the Ashen One who had found refuge within the painted world and risen to a position of authority within its hierarchy, represented both the potential and the limitations of this approach to maintaining sanctuary for the exiled. Her own history as one who had failed in her attempt to link the fire and had subsequently sought alternative forms of purpose and meaning made her a natural resident of a realm dedicated to providing second chances for those whose original destinies had proved unachievable. Friday's resistance to the renewal cycle that was meant to cleanse the painted world of accumulated rot revealed the complex motivations that could drive even those who had found refuge in such sanctuaries. Her opposition to the burning of the world arose not from malice or short-sighted selfishness, but from a genuine belief that the current arrangement, however flawed, was preferable to the uncertainty and potential suffering that might accompany its destruction and recreation. This conflict between preservation and renewal, between maintaining flawed stability and risking transformation toward unknown possibilities, reflected broader themes that ran throughout the Dark Souls narrative. The painted world's dilemma paralleled the larger question of whether the Age of Fire should be artificially maintained despite its obvious decline, or allowed to end naturally, despite the uncertainty about what might follow. Friday's position represented the conservative impulse to maintain familiar arrangements, even when they had ceased to serve their original purposes effectively. Yet the world she sought to preserve had indeed begun to show signs of the very corruption that the renewal cycle was designed to prevent. The Corvian settlement, populated by beings who had been transformed by exposure to forces they could not control or understand, demonstrated what happened when the painted world's protective mechanisms began to fail. These crow-like creatures, whose original forms and identities had been lost to metamorphoses that left them neither fully human nor fully animal, represented the kind of tragic transformation that the world's cyclical renewal was meant to prevent through controlled destruction and recreation. The imprisonment of the young painter, the being whose artistic vision would be necessary for creating the next iteration of the painted world, revealed the extent to which Friday's commitment to preservation had become a form of tyranny that prevented the very possibility of genuine renewal. The painter's confinement was justified through arguments about protection and safety, but it served primarily to maintain a status quo that had become incompatible with the organic processes of growth and change that characterized healthy existence. Into this situation of artificial stagnation and suppressed potential came Slave Knight Gale, a figure whose devotion to the imprisoned painter represented one of the purest forms of love and loyalty to be found anywhere in the Dark Souls universe. Unlike the complex political motivations and institutional obligations that drove so many other characters, Gale's dedication arose from simple recognition of worth and beauty, from his understanding that the painter possessed abilities and vision that could create genuinely new possibilities for existence in a world where such possibilities had become increasingly rare. Gale's willingness to sacrifice everything in service of the painter's artistic vision, to venture beyond the boundaries of the painted world into territories where even more extreme forms of exile and transformation awaited, demonstrated the kind of absolute commitment that transcended ordinary categories of heroism and villainy. His quest to obtain the dark soul pigment necessary for the painter's work required him to confront forces and undergo changes that would ultimately destroy his individual identity while preserving his essential purpose. The tragedy of Gale's transformation from devoted protector to maddened monster, consuming the very essence he had sought to preserve, reflected the broader tragic patterns that characterize so much of the Dark Souls narrative. His success in gathering the Dark Soul pigment came at the cost of his sanity and his ability to complete the mission that had motivated his entire quest. Like Artorias before him, Gale fell victim to the very forces he sought to overcome, transformed from hero into obstacle by exposure to powers that exceeded his capacity to control or resist. Yet Gale's transformation differed from that of Artorias in crucial ways that suggested the possibility of genuine progress despite apparent failure. Where Artorias' corruption served only the forces of chaos and destruction, Gale's madness remained oriented toward his original purpose, even as it made him incapable of achieving that purpose through his own actions. The dark soul that consumed his sanity also concentrated within his being the very essence that the painter needed for her work, creating a situation where his apparent failure could be transformed into ultimate success through the intervention of others who shared his commitment to the painter's vision. The battle between the Ashen One and the transformed Gale represented not a simple conflict between hero and monster, but a complex form of collaboration between beings who shared common goals but had been forced by circumstances beyond their control to adopt opposing roles. Gale's attacks, while genuinely dangerous and arising from madness rather than conscious intention, served to test the Ashen One's worthiness to complete the mission that Gale could no longer finish himself. His death provided both the pigment necessary for the painter's work and validation that the Ashen One possessed the strength and dedication necessary to see the project through to completion. The pigment extracted from Gale's blood and soul represented more than mere artistic material. It contained within itself the concentrated essence of human experience, the accumulated suffering and hope of countless generations who had struggled against the limitations and corruptions that characterized existence within the declining Age of Fire. This was not simply paint, but the fundamental substance from which new realities could be created, the raw material of possibility itself distilled through sacrifice and transformation into a form that could be shaped by artistic vision into previously inconceivable forms of beauty and meaning. The painter's promise that the new world created with this pigment would be cold, dark, and very gentle suggested possibilities that transcended the familiar dichotomies that had defined existence throughout the Age of Fire. This would not be simply another refuge for outcasts, or another attempt to preserve familiar arrangements against the forces of change and decay. Instead, it represented the possibility of genuinely new forms of existence that could accommodate complexity and contradiction without requiring the exclusion or suppression of elements that could not be easily categorized or controlled. The gentleness that the painter promised spoke to a fundamental shift in the principles that would govern the new reality, moving away from systems based on dominance and control toward arrangements that could accommodate difference without requiring uniformity, that could maintain stability without preventing growth and change, that could provide safety without creating the kind of isolation and limitation that had characterized earlier attempts to create sanctuaries for those who could not thrive within established systems. Yet even as we contemplate the promises offered by the new painted world and the sacrifices that made its creation possible, we must acknowledge the broader patterns of exile and transformation that made such extreme measures necessary. The painted worlds, for all their beauty and potential, remained responses to fundamental problems rather than solutions to them. They provided refuge for individuals who could not find acceptance within the established order, but they did not address the systemic issues that made such refuges necessary in the first place. The cyclical nature of the painted world's existence, their need for periodic renewal through destruction and recreation, reflected the broader instability that characterized all attempts to create lasting alternatives to systems based on exclusion and control. Even the most benevolent and carefully constructed refuges remained vulnerable to the same forces of corruption and decay that affected everything else within the declining Age of Fire, requiring constant vigilance and periodic sacrifice to maintain their essential character and purpose. As we prepare to venture deeper into the mysteries that surround other forms of exile and sanctuary, other attempts to create spaces where different rules might apply and alternative possibilities might flourish, we carry with us the complex lessons learned from contemplating the painted worlds and those who sought refuge within them. We have discovered that even the most noble intentions can produce tragic consequences, that even the purest forms of love and devotion can be transformed into sources of suffering and loss, and that the creation of genuine alternatives to flawed systems requires sacrifices whose costs may ultimately exceed their benefits. In the depths beneath the surface of conscious awareness, where the familiar structures of reality dissolve into currents that flow according to principles older and stranger than those that govern the waking world, there exist realms whose very nature challenges our understanding of what it means to exist, to remember, to dream, and to hope for something better than what has come before. These are territories where the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness, between memory and fantasy, between individual consciousness and collective experience, have become so fluid that even the most careful observer must question their fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The vision that haunted Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, during his slow consumption of human flesh and gradual transformation from holy man into something far more terrible and complex, spoke of waters that would rise to claim the world when the fire finally failed, and the artificial structures that had maintained the Age of Fire for so long finally collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. This was not merely a prophecy of destruction, but a revelation of transformation, a glimpse of possibilities that existed beyond the familiar dichotomies of fire and darkness, light and shadow, order and chaos that had defined existence throughout the current age. The deep that Aldrich foresaw in his visions was not simply another form of darkness, not merely the absence of light or the negation of order, but something fundamentally different from both the fire that had defined the current age and the abyss that threatened to consume it. This was darkness with substance, shadow with weight, a form of existence that possessed its own internal logic and its own forms of beauty, even as it remained utterly alien to everything that the inhabitants of the surface world had learned to value and understand. The Cathedral of the Deep, which Aldrich established as a center for the worship and preparation for this coming age, served as more than merely a religious institution dedicated to an alternative vision of the future. It functioned as a laboratory where the boundaries between different forms of existence could be explored, where the faithful could begin the gradual process of adapting themselves to conditions that would prevail when the familiar structures of fire-based reality finally gave way to arrangements based on entirely different principles. The distinction between the deep that Aldrich prophesied and the abyss that had already manifested in various locations throughout the realm proved crucial for understanding both the nature of his vision and the specific threats and promises it contained. Where the abyss represented pure negation, the consumption and destruction of everything it encountered, the deep suggested the possibility of genuine transformation, the creation of new forms of existence that could accommodate complexities and contradictions that the current system could not tolerate or integrate. The creatures that emerged from the deep demonstrated characteristics that distinguished them clearly from the entities spawned by the abyss. The insects that inhabited these dark waters possessed tiny jaws lined with teeth designed not for simple destruction but for the precise work of transformation, burrowing into flesh not to destroy it, but to change it into something new and different. These were agents of metamorphosis rather than annihilation, beings whose activities served purposes that transcended the simple elimination of existing forms of life. The black dampness that enveloped the deep's emissaries when they rose to the surface world spoke to the substantial nature of this alternative reality, its existence as something more than mere absence or negation. This was liquid darkness, shadow given weight and substance, a medium through which new forms of consciousness and identity could develop and flourish, even as they remained fundamentally alien to everything that surface dwellers understood as normal or natural. The connection between the deep and the realm of Drangleic, that kingdom of fading memory and accumulated sorrow where the bearer of the curse had undertaken their own journey of discovery and transformation, suggested that the waters Aldrich envisioned might already have claimed territories that had previously been thought to exist within the normal framework of fire-based reality. The view from the Cathedral of the Deep, which revealed a dark lake spreading far below the structure, might represent not a distant future, but a present reality that had been hidden from the awareness of those who remained attached to the surface world's familiar patterns and assumptions. The possibility that Drangleic existed within or beneath these dark waters would explain many of the realm's most puzzling characteristics. Its dreamlike quality, its resistance to conventional mapping and navigation, its population of beings who seem to exist in states between life and death, memory and forgetting, purpose and aimless wandering. If the kingdom that the bearer of the curse explored was indeed located within the deep, then their journey represented not travel through conventional geographical space, but descent into layers of reality that operated according to fundamentally different principles. The opening cinematic of Dark Souls 2, which showed the bearer of the curse falling through dark water into the realm of things betwixt and eventually into Drangleic itself, might document not metaphorical descent into despair or madness, but literal immersion into waters that existed outside the normal framework of fire-based existence. The bright fireflies that greeted the bearer upon their arrival could represent not mere atmospheric decoration, but guides specifically adapted to help newcomers navigate environments where conventional sources of illumination prove inadequate or misleading. The land that the bearer awakened in possessed that mysterious aura that characterized spaces where different forms of reality intersected and overlapped, creating conditions where the familiar rules that governed cause and effect, identity and memory, purpose and achievement could no longer be taken for granted. The warning delivered by the Emerald Herald about the potential for Drangleic to swallow visitors whole might reference not metaphorical absorption into hopelessness, but literal integration into forms of existence that transcended individual consciousness, while preserving essential aspects of identity and experience in radically transformed configurations. This interpretation of Drangleic as existing within or beneath the deep would cast the bearer of the curse's journey in an entirely new light, transforming their quest from a relatively straightforward attempt to cure their undead condition into something far more complex and significant. Their exploration of the kingdom would represent not travel through a conventional fantasy realm, but investigation of alternative possibilities for consciousness and existence, experimentation with forms of identity and purpose that remained unavailable to those who remained trapped within the limiting assumptions of fire-based reality. The Broken Lord vessel, found in the basement of the Modular Mansion, would gain additional significance under this interpretation, serving not merely as a nostalgic reference to the events of Dark Souls, but as evidence of the transformation that occurred when artifacts of the fire-based system encountered the different principles that governed existence within the deep. The vessel's destruction might represent not accidental damage, but necessary adaptation. The breakdown of structures designed for one form of reality when exposed to the requirements of an entirely different system. King Vendrick's obsession with understanding and potentially overcoming the curse that afflicted his realm would take on new dimensions if viewed as an attempt to comprehend the relationship between the conventional world of fire and darkness and the alternative reality of the deep that had claimed his kingdom. His creation of golems powered by souls might represent experiments in developing forms of artificial consciousness that could function effectively within the transformed conditions that characterized existence beneath the dark waters. The statues that populated the landscape of Drangleic, those silent sentinels powered by soul energy and animated by forces that transcended normal understanding, might serve as more than mere guardians or obstacles. They could function as interfaces between different forms of consciousness, beings specifically designed to facilitate communication and interaction between visitors who retained memories of fire-based existence and the native inhabitants of the deep who had adapted to entirely different ways of being and understanding. The emergence of the undead curse itself might represent not a supernatural affliction imposed by external forces, but a natural response to the gradual immersion of fire-based reality into the deep's transformative influence. The inability of those marked by the dark sign to die permanently could reflect their partial adaptation to conditions where conventional distinctions between life and death no longer applied, where consciousness could persist through transformations that would normally be considered fatal within fire-based systems. This interpretation would explain the dreamlike quality that pervaded so much of the experience in Drangleic, the sense that events occurred according to logic that remained partially hidden from direct observation. If the realm existed within the deep, then the experiences of those who ventured into it would necessarily partake of the qualities that characterized that alternative reality. Fluidity of identity, persistence of consciousness through apparent dissolution, transformation of familiar concepts and relationships into forms that retained essential meaning while adopting radically different expressions. The fog that surrounded so many transitions within Drangleic might represent not mere atmospheric effect, but the literal medium through which consciousness moved when traveling between different layers or regions within the deep. This would be fog with substance and purpose, a form of organized darkness that could facilitate movement and transformation while protecting travelers from changes that might otherwise prove too rapid or overwhelming for their adapted fire-based consciousness to process and integrate successfully. The various queens who appeared throughout Drangleic, those fragments of Manus who sought to manipulate and influence the realm's rulers, might represent not external threats infiltrating from the abyss, but natural inhabitants of the deep, whose forms of consciousness and motivation remained alien to visitors accustomed to fire-based thinking. Their apparent hostility might arise not from malicious intent, but from fundamental incompatibilities between different approaches to existence and relationship, conflicts that emerged when beings adapted to different realities, attempted to interact without adequate understanding of each other's essential nature. The Emerald Herald herself, that mysterious guide who offered assistance to the bearer of the curse while maintaining her own agenda and concealing crucial aspects of her identity, might represent a bridge between different forms of existence rather than simply another character with hidden motivations. Her claim to have been born of dragons and contrived by men might reference not conventional biological processes but forms of creation and development that could occur only within the transformed conditions that characterized the deep. Her guidance toward the throne that awaited the bearer of the curse might constitute not manipulation toward predetermined goals, but education about possibilities for consciousness and identity that remained unavailable to those who had never experienced existence outside the limiting framework of fire-based reality. The throne itself might represent not political power, but a state of being where individual consciousness could expand beyond conventional boundaries while retaining coherent identity and purpose. The theory that Drangleic existed primarily as a dream rather than conventional geographical reality would gain additional support if the realm were located within the deep, where the boundaries between different states of consciousness had become fluid enough to allow for forms of existence that combined elements of sleeping and waking experience. This would not be a dream in the sense of mere fantasy or escapism, but a dream as an alternative mode of consciousness that could accommodate complexities and paradoxes that waking thought found impossible to integrate or understand. The inhabitants of such a dream realm would necessarily display the characteristics that observers had noted in the populations of Drangleic: the tendency toward forgetting and confusion, the difficulty in maintaining consistent identities and purposes, the apparent ability to exist in states that combined elements of life and death in ways that conventional understanding found paradoxical or impossible. These would not be flaws or limitations, but adaptations to conditions where consciousness operated according to different principles and served different functions. The bearer of the curse's own condition, marked by the gradual loss of memory and identity that accompanied the progression of their curse, might represent not disease or supernatural affliction, but natural preparation for existence within a reality where individual consciousness needed to become more fluid and less rigidly defined in order to function effectively. Their journey through Drangleic could constitute a gradual education process, a series of experiences designed to help them develop the psychological and spiritual flexibility necessary for thriving within the deep's transformed conditions. The various forms of hollowing that afflicted the realm's inhabitants might represent different stages in this adaptation process, different approaches to the challenge of maintaining meaningful existence while allowing individual identity to become more fluid and responsive to changing conditions. Those who successfully navigated this transformation would retain essential aspects of their humanity while gaining access to forms of consciousness and relationships that remained unavailable to those trapped within the rigid categories that characterized fire-based existence. The four great souls that the bearer sought throughout their journey might represent not merely sources of power necessary for approaching the throne, but keys to understanding different aspects of the transformation that consciousness underwent when adapting to existence within the deep. Each soul would carry within it the accumulated experience of beings who had successfully navigated particular challenges associated with the transition from fire-based to deep-based existence, providing templates and guidance for others who undertook similar journeys. The cyclical nature of the process, the way that heroes arose periodically to link the fire and then faded into legend and memory, might reflect not the repetitive futility, that surface observers perceived, but the necessary rhythm through which consciousness gradually adapted to the requirements of existence within multiple realities simultaneously. Each cycle would advance the overall process slightly, contributing to the slow transformation of fire-based reality into something that could coexist peacefully with the deep, without requiring the elimination or suppression of either alternative. The ultimate fate of those who completed the journey and claimed the throne might involve not assumption of conventional political power, but graduation to forms of existence that transcended the limitations and conflicts that had made such extreme measures necessary in the first place. They would become bridges between different realities, beings capable of facilitating communication and cooperation between forms of consciousness that had previously seemed fundamentally incompatible. Yet, even as we explore these possibilities for understanding Drangleic as existing within or adjacent to the deep that Aldrich envisioned, we must acknowledge that the relationship between dreams and reality, between individual consciousness and collective experience, between memory and forgetting, remains complex enough to resist simple categorization or explanation. The realm that the bearer of the curse explored possessed characteristics that could support multiple interpretations simultaneously, suggesting that its true nature might transcend the familiar categories that we use to distinguish between different forms of existence. The dark waters that spread beneath the cathedral of the deep might simultaneously be literal ocean and metaphorical representation, genuine alternative reality, and symbolic expression of psychological and spiritual states that could not be adequately described through conventional language and concepts. The insects that dwelt within these waters might be both actual creatures and manifestations of transformative processes that operated within consciousness itself, agents of change that worked simultaneously in the external world and in the internal landscapes of individual minds and souls. The gentleness that characterized Aldrich's vision of the deep, despite its fundamental alienness to everything that surface dwellers understood as normal or desirable, might reflect genuine compassion for forms of consciousness that had been unable to find adequate expression within the restrictive framework of fire-based reality. The deep might offer not conquest or destruction, but genuine refuge, sanctuary for ways of being and understanding that had been systematically excluded from the established order, not because they were evil or dangerous, but because they challenged assumptions that those in power found necessary for maintaining their control. As we prepare to venture deeper into the mysteries that surround the relationship between consciousness and reality, between individual experience and collective transformation, between the familiar structures of waking existence and the fluid possibilities that emerge when those structures begin to dissolve, we carry with us the insights gained from contemplating the deep and its promise of transformation. We have discovered that the most profound changes often begin in waters too dark to see clearly, that the most important journeys may lead not to destinations that can be mapped or measured, but to ways of being that transcend the limitations of conventional geography and chronology. The currents that flow beneath the surface of apparent reality continue to shape and reshape the possibilities available to consciousness, creating opportunities for forms of existence that remain invisible to those who confine their attention to the familiar territories of fire and shadow. These deeper waters promise not escape from the challenges of existence, but transformation of those challenges into sources of growth and expansion that could never be achieved through mere preservation of existing arrangements or simple negation of established orders. Beneath the surface of apparent reality, where the familiar mechanisms of cause and effect give way to forces that operate according to principles older and more fundamental than those that govern the visible world, There move beings whose true nature and ultimate purposes remain shrouded in mysteries that have persisted since the earliest days of recorded history. These ancient entities work through patience and subtlety rather than direct confrontation, their influence manifesting not through obvious displays of power, but through careful manipulation of circumstances and gradual shaping of events across spans of time that exceed the comprehension of ordinary mortal consciousness. The primordial serpents, those enigmatic figures whose counsel has influenced the fate of heroes and kingdoms throughout multiple ages, represent perhaps the most complex and ambiguous forces in the entire Dark Souls universe. Their very existence challenges conventional understanding of the relationships between guidance and manipulation, between wisdom and deception, between service and self-interest. These creatures appear to offer assistance and advice to those who encounter them, yet the nature of their aid remains so layered with hidden implications and ulterior motives that even the most careful analysis struggles to determine whether their influence ultimately serves beneficial or malevolent purposes. King Seeker Frampt presents himself as a faithful servant of the established order, a loyal counselor whose primary concern lies in ensuring the continuation of the Age of Fire through the proper linking of the flame by a worthy successor to Lord Gwyn. His guidance appears straightforward and benevolent, directing the chosen undead toward the completion of a quest that will preserve the light and prevent the world from falling into the darkness that preceded the current age. His manner suggests ancient wisdom combined with genuine concern for the welfare of those he advises, creating an impression of trustworthiness that encourages confidence in his counsel. Yet even in his most apparently helpful moments, Frampt's advice carries undertones that suggest motivations more complex than simple desire to preserve the established order. His eagerness to see the flame linked, his insistence that this represents the only acceptable outcome for the chosen undead's quest, and his careful omission of information about alternative possibilities all hint at an agenda that extends beyond mere preservation of the status quo. The urgency that characterizes his guidance suggests not disinterested wisdom but personal investment in particular outcomes, investment that implies stakes and motivations that remain carefully concealed from those who seek his aid. Darkstalker Kaith presents what appears to be the diametric opposite of Frampt's counsel, urging the chosen undead to reject the path of fire linking and instead embrace their destiny as the harbinger of a new age of dark. His arguments possess their own compelling logic, suggesting that the artificial prolongation of the Age of Fire represents not noble preservation but unnatural stagnation, a system that prevents the world from undergoing the changes necessary for genuine renewal and growth. The darkness he advocates appears not as destructive force, but as creative potential, the fertile void from which new forms of existence might emerge. Kaith's revelation of hidden histories and suppressed truths lends credibility to his alternative vision, providing evidence that the established narratives about the nature of fire and darkness have been shaped by those in power to serve their own interests, rather than to reflect objective reality. His account of Gwyn's fear of the dark soul and the systematic oppression of humanity's true potential offers explanations for many of the contradictions and problems that characterize the current age, suggesting that the difficulties faced by the undead and other marginalized groups arise not from natural necessity, but from artificial constraints imposed by those who benefit from maintaining the existing hierarchy. Yet Kaith's guidance, like that of Frampt, carries implications that extend far beyond his stated objectives. His emphasis on the necessity of embracing darkness, his insistence that the Age of Fire must end for genuine progress to occur, and his careful presentation of the choice between fire and dark as absolute and unavoidable, all suggest forms of manipulation that parallel those employed by his supposed rival. The liberation he promises may prove to be simply another form of constraint. The freedom he offers merely a different type of servitude to forces that remain beyond the understanding or control of those who accept his counsel. The possibility that both serpents serve the same ultimate purpose, despite their apparent opposition, emerges from careful examination of their methods and motivations. The choice they present to the chosen undead between linking the fire and embracing darkness may itself constitute a form of deception, a false dilemma designed to channel decision-making toward outcomes that serve the serpent's hidden agenda, regardless of which apparent alternative is selected. The very structure of the choice, with its emphasis on dramatic opposition between light and dark, may prevent consideration of possibilities that transcend or integrate these supposedly fundamental categories. This interpretation suggests that the serpents function not as advocates for particular philosophical or political positions, but as agents of a testing process designed to identify individuals capable of transcending conventional thinking and achieving forms of understanding that exceed the limitations imposed by familiar conceptual frameworks. The apparent opposition between Framt and Cather may serve as a comprehensive examination system, one that evaluates potential candidates from multiple perspectives before determining their suitability for purposes that remain hidden from the candidates themselves. The cut content from the original Dark Souls that featured Oscar of Astora as a parallel chosen undead, who would ultimately be guided by whichever serpent the player did not choose, supports this interpretation of the serpents as coordinators of a comprehensive testing system. Under this scenario, Oscar would serve as a control subject, demonstrating the consequences of choosing the alternative path while providing a direct comparison that would allow for evaluation of the player's decisions and their implications. The final confrontation between the two chosen undead would represent not arbitrary conflict, but the culmination of an elaborate experiment designed to determine which approach to the fundamental challenges of existence proves most effective. The serpent's apparent willingness to accept either outcome suggests that both fire-linking and dark-embracing serve their larger purposes, that the specific choice made by individual candidates matters less than the process of choosing itself and the qualities of consciousness and character that the choosing reveals. This would transform the entire quest from a straightforward heroic journey with clear moral implications into something far more complex and ambiguous, a sophisticated evaluation system designed to identify and cultivate forms of awareness that transcend ordinary human limitations. The continuation of serpentine influence into the events of Dark Souls 3 provides additional evidence for this interpretation of their role as coordinators of long-term processes that span multiple ages and cycles. The Sable Church of Londo, with its emphasis on usurpation of the fire rather than simple linking or extinguishing, represents a synthesis that incorporates elements from both traditional approaches while transcending the limitations of either. The Church's teachings suggest that the choice between fire and dark was indeed a false dilemma, that genuine resolution requires approaches that integrate, rather than choose between these fundamental forces. The pilgrims who journey to Lothric under the Church's guidance demonstrate the practical consequences of serpentine influence, extending across centuries and affecting entire populations, rather than merely individual heroes. These travelers, bound in shells that contain their transformative potential while protecting them from premature manifestation of their true nature, represent a systematic approach to consciousness development that operates on a massive scale. Their pilgrimage serves not mere religious devotion, but practical preparation for transformations that will fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. The connection between these pilgrims and the spread of what appears to be darkness or corruption throughout Lothric reveals the extent to which the serpent's influence has shaped the conditions that prevail during the final crisis of the Age of Fire. The butterflies that emerge from the pilgrims' shells, the trees that grow from hollowed forms, and the angels that appear in response to certain transformations all suggest that the apparent spread of darkness actually represents the emergence of new forms of existence that transcend the conventional categories that have defined reality throughout the current age. The theory that these pilgrims serve as agents of Carthy's continuing influence gains support from Uria's final words, referencing the serpent's unfulfilled dying wish. But the nature of that wish may prove more complex than simple desire to bring about an age of dark. If the serpents indeed serve testing and development functions rather than simple advocacy for particular outcomes, then Carthy's true goal may have been the cultivation of consciousness, capable of transcending the fire-dark dichotomy entirely, the development of individuals who could create genuinely new possibilities rather than merely choosing between existing alternatives. The mechanical precision with which the pilgrims undergo their transformations, the systematic nature of their journey and its effects, and the coordinated timing of their arrival in Lothric all suggest planning and organization that extends far beyond what individual religious devotion or even institutional coordination could achieve. These phenomena require the kind of long-term perspective and comprehensive understanding that only entities capable of perceiving and manipulating processes across multiple centuries could possess and effectively employ. The shells that contain the pilgrims during their journey serve multiple functions that reveal the sophisticated nature of the transformation process they undergo. These structures protect their occupants from environmental influences that might interfere with their development, while also preventing premature manifestation of capabilities that could prove dangerous if expressed before the proper time and circumstances. Most importantly, they serve as cocoons within which fundamental changes in the nature of consciousness and identity can occur without the interference of external pressures or internal resistance that might otherwise prevent successful completion of the rites. Transformation. The cleric's description of these shells as preventing the pilgrims from becoming seedbeds for spreading darkness may reflect conventional understanding of their function, but the reality appears more complex and potentially more positive than this interpretation suggests. If the darkness that the shells contain represents not destructive force but transformative potential, then their function may be protective not only for the world at large but for the pilgrims themselves, ensuring that their metamorphosis can proceed safely and completely before its effects become visible to external observers. The emergence of pilgrim butterflies from successful transformations demonstrates that the process guided by the shells can indeed produce results that transcend conventional categories of existence. These creatures combine elements that should be incompatible according to normal understanding, integrating organic and mineral components in ways that suggest entirely new forms of life that operate according to previously unknown principles. Their ability to control and direct powerful entities like the Dragonslayer armor indicates capabilities that exceed those of ordinary biological organisms, while remaining oriented toward purposes that serve larger patterns of development and change. The connection between the pilgrim's transformation and the angelic imagery that appears throughout the later phases of Dark Souls 3 suggests that their ultimate purpose may involve not the spread of darkness, but the emergence of forms of existence that integrate light and shadow in previously impossible ways. The angels that appear in response to certain conditions may represent successful completions of the transformation process, beings who have achieved the synthesis of opposing forces that the serpents have been working toward throughout their long involvement in human affairs. This interpretation would cast the serpent's activities in an entirely different light, transforming them from manipulative antagonists or partisan advocates into something approaching cosmic gardeners, entities whose patient cultivation of consciousness across multiple ages serves not their own narrow interests, but the broader development of possibilities for existence that could never emerge through natural processes alone. Their willingness to work with both fire and darkness, their acceptance of multiple outcomes from their guidance, and their apparent satisfaction with results that seem to contradict their stated preferences all make sense if their true goal involves the transcendence of conventional limitations rather than victory for particular philosophical or political positions. The double-headed serpent imagery that appears in various locations throughout the series may represent not symbolic reference to the relationship between Frampt and Kaith, but literal indication of their fundamental unity. The apparent opposition between their council may be performance rather than genuine conflict, a carefully orchestrated presentation designed to provide comprehensive testing of those who encounter them while concealing the true nature of the process they coordinate. The Aztec and other mythological traditions that feature double-headed serpents often associate these creatures with the integration of opposing forces, the bridging of earth and sky, the unification of complementary principles that appear contradictory when viewed from limited perspectives. If the primordial serpents indeed represent such integrative forces, then their influence throughout the Dark Souls series serves not the advancement of particular agendas, but the cultivation of consciousness capable of perceiving and working with the fundamental unity that underlies apparent opposition, the patient nature of the serpent's work. Their willingness to invest centuries in the development of individuals and institutions that may never fully understand the purposes they serve demonstrates commitment to objectives that transcend immediate results or temporary advantages. This kind of long-term perspective requires forms of consciousness that exist partially outside normal temporal constraints, awareness that can perceive patterns and possibilities across spans of time that would overwhelm ordinary minds with their complexity and scope. The furtive pygmy, that mysterious figure whose discovery of the dark soul initiated the entire sequence of events that would define human history, may represent the original subject of the serpent's attention and guidance. The easily forgotten nature of this primordial human, combined with the systematic suppression of human potential that characterized much of the Age of Fire, suggests that the pygmy's true significance was recognized and feared by those who established the current order, leading to deliberate efforts to minimize and conceal the implications of humanity's unique nature. The search for the pygmy's true identity has generated numerous theories, each attempting to identify specific individuals who might have filled this crucial role in the development of human potential. The possibility that Manus, the father of the Abyss, represents the corrupted form of the original pygmy gains support from his description as primeval human, but his transformation into an agent of destructive chaos seems inconsistent with the creative potential that the Dark Soul was meant to represent. Alternative theories suggesting that figures like Velka, the goddess of sin, might actually be the furtive pygmy gain credibility from her complex relationship with both divine authority and human justice. But the explicitly masculine references to the pygmy in original sources create complications for this interpretation. The revelation in the Ringed City DLC that there were actually multiple pygmy lords rather than a single furtive pygmy adds layers of complexity that may either clarify or further obscure the original pygmy's identity and significance. The possibility that Patches, that recurring figure whose appearances throughout the series are marked by consistent patterns of behavior and apparent continuity of memory across ages, might represent the true furtive pygmy gains support from his ubiquity and his tendency to remain overlooked despite his obvious significance. His name's connection to concepts of mending and repair, his survival across multiple cycles when other figures fade into obscurity, and his apparent immunity to the various forms of corruption that claim other characters, all suggest capabilities that transcend ordinary human limitations. The Hollow found in the Ringed City, who has lost all memory of his original identity, yet retains connections to Patches through gesture and behavior, may represent the final stage of the forgetting process that was meant to erase furtive pygmy from history and consciousness. If this interpretation proves correct, then Patches' various appearances throughout the series represent not simple recurring character design, but the gradual revelation of a figure whose true significance has been systematically obscured through deliberate historical manipulation. The irony that the most easily forgotten figure in Dark Souls history might be the most frequently encountered character in the series would be entirely appropriate for a narrative that consistently demonstrates how the most important truths are often hidden in plain sight, concealed not through elaborate deception, but through the simple expedient of being so obvious that they are overlooked by those seeking more dramatic or complex explanations. The serpent's potential role in either concealing or preserving the memory of the furtive pygmy adds another layer to their already complex motivations and activities. If they indeed serve as coordinators of long-term consciousness development, then their relationship with humanity's original nature and potential would be crucial for understanding both their methods and their ultimate objectives. The systematic suppression of human potential that characterized much of the Age of Fire may have been necessary not to prevent catastrophic unleashing of dangerous forces, but to ensure that humanity's true capabilities would manifest only when consciousness had developed sufficient sophistication to handle such power responsibly. This interpretation would transform the entire Dark Souls narrative from a story about the decline and fall of a golden age into something far more optimistic, an account of the gradual preparation for humanity's assumption of responsibilities and capabilities that were always meant to be theirs, but which required extensive development and testing before they could be safely and effectively employed. The various heroes who answered the call to link the fire or embrace the darkness would then represent not desperate measures to preserve a failing system, but carefully selected participants in a comprehensive training program designed to cultivate the kinds of consciousness that would be required for the next phase of existence. As we prepare to delve deeper into the mysteries that surround identity and transformation, purpose and destiny, the individual and the collective, we carry with us the insights gained from contemplating the serpents and their patient work across the ages. We have discovered that the most profound guidance often comes disguised as opposition, that the most important choices may be between alternatives that are themselves illusions, and that the development of consciousness may require forms of testing and cultivation that span far longer periods and involve far more complex processes than individual minds can easily comprehend or appreciate. In the cathedral depths where shadows gather like congregants seeking absolution from sins they cannot name, there exists a figure whose very presence transforms the nature of the sacred space that contains her, whose silence speaks more eloquently than any sermon ever delivered from gilded pulpits or marble altars. Behind iron bars that serve as much to protect as to contain, Rosaria, the mother of rebirth, lies upon a bed that has become both throne and prison, her form draped in robes that cannot conceal the mystery of her identity or the tragedy of her condition. The cathedral that houses Rosaria bears all the architectural grandeur that once characterized the great religious institutions of the Age of Fire. Its soaring arches, and intricate stonework testament to the devotion and skill of those who built it as a monument to divine glory. Yet the atmosphere that pervades this sacred space speaks not of triumphant faith but of something far more complex and troubling, a spiritual environment where reverence and desperation have become so intermingled that they are no longer distinguishable from one another. The covenant that Rosaria formed with her devoted fingers represents one of the most unusual relationships between divine figures and mortal followers to be found anywhere within the Dark Souls universe. Unlike the traditional religious organizations that sought to spread particular doctrines or advance specific theological agendas, Rosaria's covenant exists primarily to serve the deeply personal needs of individuals who have found themselves unable to continue living with the consequences of choices they have made or circumstances they have inherited through no fault of their own. The power of rebirth that Rosaria offers extends far beyond mere physical transformation or cosmetic alteration, though it encompasses those capabilities as well. Her gift represents the possibility of genuine renewal, the opportunity to reconsider fundamental aspects of identity and purpose that most beings must accept as immutable facts of their existence. For those who have discovered that their original nature proves incompatible with the roles and relationships that give meaning to their lives, Rosaria's power offers hope that such incompatibilities need not be permanent or irreversible. Yet this power comes at costs that extend beyond the obvious physical requirements of the transformation process itself. The tongues that Rosaria's fingers bring to her as offerings represent more than mere trophies taken from defeated enemies or symbols of devotion expressed through violence. These organs of speech embody the capacity for communication and connection that defines much of what makes existence meaningful, and their sacrifice suggests forms of dedication that transcend ordinary understanding of loyalty and service. The irony that surrounds Rosaria's own condition adds layers of complexity to the covenant she oversees, transforming what might otherwise be a straightforward narrative of divine benevolence into something far more morally ambiguous and emotionally complex. The Mother of Rebirth, who possesses the power to grant others the profound transformations they desire, has herself been deprived of the ability to speak, robbed of her tongue by circumstances that remain shrouded in mystery but whose consequences continue to define her relationship with those who seek her aid. The description of Rosaria as having been robbed of her tongue by her firstborn introduces familial dynamics that complicate any simple interpretation of her role as purely benevolent divine figure offering aid to those in need. The suggestion that this deprivation was inflicted by someone who should have been bound to her through bonds of love and loyalty transforms her silence from noble sacrifice into evidence of betrayal and abuse, casting shadow over the sanctuary she provides for others who have suffered similar violations of trust and natural affection. The mystery of Rosaria's true identity has generated extensive speculation among those who study the complex genealogies and hidden relationships that connect the various divine figures throughout the Dark Souls series. Her ability to grant rebirth, combined with her association with sunlight-based miracles and her presence within a cathedral that bears architectural similarities to the great religious institutions of previous ages, suggests connections to the established divine hierarchy that ruled during the height of the Age of Fire. The possibility that Rosaria might actually be Guinevere, that princess of sunlight whose radiance once blessed the silver halls of Anor Londo, gains credibility from the miraculous powers associated with both figures and their shared connections to themes of motherhood and nurturing care. The bountiful sunlight miracle that can be created from Rosaria's soul bears the same name as the special blessing that was once granted by Guinevere's maidens, suggesting direct continuity between these figures, despite the dramatic differences in their circumstances and apparent fates. This identification would cast Rosaria's current condition in particularly tragic light, transforming her from unknown divine figure, suffering mysterious persecution, into one of the most celebrated and beloved members of the original pantheon, reduced to imprisoned silence after centuries of decline and betrayal. The princess who once embodied the warmth and generosity of divine love would have become a figure whose power to grant transformation arose from intimate personal knowledge of how completely one's essential nature could be altered by forces beyond one's control. Yet alternative theories propose different identities for the silent goddess, each carrying its own implications for understanding both her individual story and her role within the broader narrative of divine decline and transformation. The possibility that Rosaria might be Gertrude, the heavenly daughter who was once imprisoned in the Grand Archives, would explain both her confinement and her connection to miracles associated with divine authority, while also accounting for the similarities between their physical circumstances and the environments that contain them. Gertrude's description as mute, combined with her association with angelic visions and divine communication, creates parallels with Rosaria's condition that extend beyond mere coincidence. Both figures have been deprived of speech. Both are associated with forms of divine power that operate outside conventional religious hierarchies, and both exist in states of imprisonment that serve multiple functions simultaneously, protecting them from external threats, while also preventing them from exercising their full capabilities in ways that might challenge established authorities. The man grubs that appear in association with both Gertrude's former prison and Rosaria's current sanctuary suggest connections between these figures that transcend simple architectural coincidence. These creatures, whose forms combine human and insect characteristics in ways that defy natural classification, might represent the results of transformative processes that operate in the vicinity of powerful divine figures, whose capabilities exceed the normal boundaries of physical and spiritual manipulation. The presence of these hybrid beings near both locations implies that the power to grant rebirth and transformation affects not only those who actively seek such changes, but also the environment and inhabitants of spaces where such power is concentrated and regularly employed. The man grubs might serve as living evidence of how exposure to transformative divine energy can produce changes that extend far beyond the conscious intentions of either the divine figure who wields such power or the individuals who seek to benefit from its effects. Leonard, the most devoted of Rosaria's fingers, embodies both the potential nobility and the inherent tragedy that characterizes service to divine figures, whose power operates outside conventional moral and theological frameworks. His dedication to Rosaria transcends ordinary religious devotion, representing instead a form of love that has become so absolute that it transforms the lover into something that might no longer be recognizable as entirely human, despite the retention of human form and the persistence of recognizably human motivations. The mask that Leonard wears to conceal the scars of burns he suffered in his youth speaks to the relationship between physical transformation and spiritual rebirth that defines much of Rosaria's appeal to those who seek her aid. His decision to refrain from using her power to heal his disfigurement, choosing instead to preserve the marks of his suffering as permanent reminders of his need for her compassion, demonstrates forms of devotion that transcend simple desire for personal benefit or improvement. Yet Leonard's ultimate act, the killing of Rosaria herself and the theft of her soul, reveals the complex and potentially destructive nature of love that becomes so consuming that it loses connection to the welfare and autonomy of its object. His belief that he must protect Rosaria from the offerings and requests of other supplicants transforms devotion into possessiveness, care into control, love into a form of violation that destroys what it claims to preserve. The location where Leonard takes Rosaria's soul Returning to the chamber in Anor Londo that once housed Guinevere before her departure from the Silver City suggests that his actions are motivated not merely by jealous possessiveness, but by genuine belief in Rosaria's true identity and his responsibility to restore her to her proper place within the divine hierarchy. His declaration that those who approach her seek to ravage her soul reflects his perception of the requests for rebirth as forms of spiritual assault, rather than legitimate appeals for aid. This interpretation casts Leonard not as a simple stalker or possessive lover, but as guardian who has appointed himself protector of a divine figure whose own capacity for self-protection has been compromised by the very compassion that makes her valuable to those who seek her aid. His killing of Rosaria becomes not murder but a form of rescue operation, an attempt to liberate her from circumstances that force her to exhaust herself in service of others, while receiving nothing in return except continued imprisonment and exploitation. The tragedy of Leonard's devotion lies in its fundamental misunderstanding of what Rosaria actually needs or desires. Its assumption that protection requires isolation and that salvation must be imposed rather than chosen. His love for Rosaria, however genuine and self-sacrificing, operates according to logic that prioritizes his own understanding of her welfare over her own agency and autonomy, transforming care into another form of the control and manipulation from which he believes he is rescuing her. Yet even as we contemplate the complex dynamics of devotion and control that characterize Leonard's relationship with Rosaria, alternative theories propose entirely different interpretations of her identity and significance, each carrying its own implications for understanding both her individual story and her place within the broader patterns of divine genealogy and transformation that define the Dark Souls universe. The possibility that Rosaria represents not Guinevere or Gertrude, but the mother of Guinevere herself, the wife of Gwyn whose identity has remained largely hidden throughout the series, would explain both the power she wields and the circumstances that led to her current condition. If the Nameless King, Gwyn's firstborn son who was stripped of his divine status and erased from historical records, was indeed responsible for depriving his mother of her tongue, then Rosaria's silence becomes evidence of familial conflict that extends far beyond simple disagreements over policy or theology. Under this interpretation, the Nameless King's rebellion against the established divine order might have included direct confrontation with family members who supported or embodied aspects of that order that he found unacceptable or corrupting. His mother's association with the darker aspects of divine power, suggested by her ability to grant transformation through processes that required the sacrifice of tongues and other forms of spiritual currency, might have convinced him that she represented a threat to the principles he was developing through his alliance with the ancient dragons. The punishment of silencing would carry particular symbolic weight if inflicted by a son upon a mother whose power depended partly upon her ability to communicate with and command those who sought her aid. By removing her tongue, the Nameless King would have neutralized her capacity to exercise certain forms of divine authority while leaving her alive and aware of her loss, creating a form of imprisonment that was both more cruel and more symbolically appropriate than simple execution would have been. The Covenant of Rosaria's Fingers, with its emphasis on invasion and the taking of tongues from other players, would then represent not arbitrary violence or meaningless aggression, but a systematic effort to restore to their goddess the very capacity for speech that was stolen from her by her own son. Each tongue offered to Rosaria becomes part of an ongoing attempt to reverse the punishment inflicted upon her, to gradually rebuild her ability to communicate and thereby restore her to something approaching her original power and dignity. This interpretation transforms the apparent brutality of the Covenant's requirements into acts of devotion and restoration, violent actions undertaken not for their own sake but in service of healing and renewal that cannot be achieved through gentler means. The fingers who invade other worlds and claim tongues from their victims become not simple murderers but participants in a complex ritual of divine restoration, agents working to undo ancient injustices through methods that necessarily mirror the violence originally employed against their patron. The irony that the son who took his mother's tongue also had his own name stripped from history creates a parallel between their punishments that suggests either poetic justice or the operation of cosmic principles that ensure that violations of natural and divine order ultimately result in consequences that reflect the nature of the original transgression. The Nameless King's loss of identity through erasure of his name parallels his mother's loss of voice through removal of her tongue, creating symmetrical punishments that demonstrate how the violation of fundamental relationships inevitably produces effects that damage the violator as much as the victim. Yet even as we explore these possibilities for understanding Rosaria's identity and the circumstances that shaped her current condition, we must acknowledge that the mystery surrounding her true nature might be more complex than any single identification could adequately explain. The power she wields, the devotion she inspires, and the tragedy that surrounds her existence all suggest significance that transcends the specific details of her genealogy or the particular circumstances of her persecution. The broader pattern of divine figures who have been transformed by suffering, who have gained their capacity to aid others through intimate knowledge of loss and violation, reflects themes that run throughout the Dark Souls universe and extend beyond any individual character or storyline. Rosaria's ability to grant rebirth emerges from her own experience of fundamental alteration, her understanding of what it means to have one's essential nature changed by forces beyond one's control or resistance. The silence that defines her current existence becomes not merely limitation or punishment, but a form of wisdom, a recognition that the most profound forms of communication transcend ordinary speech and operate through forms of presence and availability that require no words. Her covenant with those who seek transformation operates not through verbal instruction or doctrinal teaching, but through direct sharing of power and possibility, communication that bypasses language entirely and works directly upon the essential structures of identity and existence. The cathedral that houses Rosaria serves as more than mere architectural container for her activities. It functions as a sacred space where the normal rules governing identity, transformation, and relationship are suspended in favor of possibilities that exist nowhere else within the established order. Here, the assumption that one must live forever with the consequences of choices made in ignorance or circumstances imposed by accident can be challenged and potentially overcome through processes that recognize the artificial nature of many, apparently permanent limitations as we prepare to explore other mysteries that surround identity and transformation, other relationships between divine figures and mortal followers, other questions about the nature of love and devotion when exercised within systems that have been corrupted by forces too complex for simple moral evaluation. We carry with us the insights gained from contemplating Rosaria and those who serve her. We have discovered that the power to grant transformation often arises from intimate knowledge of loss, that the most profound forms of communication may require no words, and that devotion, however genuine, can become destructive when it prioritizes the lover's understanding of the beloved's needs over the beloved's own agency and choice. The mysteries that surround divine identity and familial relationships in the declining Age of Fire continue to reveal themselves as more complex and morally ambiguous than conventional narratives of heroism and villainy would suggest. requiring forms of understanding that can accommodate contradiction and paradox without demanding simple resolution or comfortable conclusion. In the shadowed corners of existence where madness masquerades as companionship and solitude transforms desperation into elaborate fantasies of connection, there dwell beings whose relationship with reality has become so tenuous that they inhabit worlds constructed entirely from their own psychological needs and unfulfilled longings. These are territories where the normal boundaries between self and other, between memory and imagination, between genuine presence and wishful projection, have dissolved under the weight of isolation and the terrible pressure of existing in a universe that seems fundamentally indifferent to the human need for meaning and relationship. The undead merchant, who tends his small collection of wares in the decrepit buildings of the undead burg, represents one of the most poignant examples of how consciousness adapts to circumstances that exceed its capacity for normal, psychological processing. His persistent conversations with Yulia, an entity that exists only in his own perception while remaining invisible to all others who encounter him, demonstrate the elaborate lengths to which the mind will go to create the illusion of companionship when genuine connection proves impossible to achieve or maintain. The merchant's behavior around the broken barrel that sits beside his makeshift shop reveals the complex nature of his psychological condition, the way that profound loneliness can transform inanimate objects into repositories for projected personality and imagined relationship. His gentle stroking of the barrel's weathered wood, his careful attention to positioning and arrangement that suggests consideration for another being's comfort, and his ongoing dialogue with an entity that provides no audible responses, all speak to forms of adaptation that are simultaneously creative and deeply troubling. The question of Yulia's identity, such as it is, opens pathways into understanding how isolation and despair can reshape consciousness in ways that create elaborate internal worlds, complete with their own rules, relationships, and narrative structures. The various theories that attempt to explain who or what Yulia might represent reveal more about the human need to find meaning and connection than they do about any objective reality that might underlie the merchant's apparent delusions. The possibility that Yulia represents a memory of the female undead merchant found in the tunnels between Firelink's shrine and the undead burg gains credibility from the geographical proximity of these figures and their shared profession, but it requires accepting that the male merchant's consciousness has become so fractured by loss and isolation that he has created an elaborate fantasy of ongoing relationship with someone who either never existed as he remembers her or has long since departed from his actual presence. Under this interpretation, the broken barrel becomes a shrine to absent companionship, a physical focus for emotions and memories that have nowhere else to direct themselves in a world where genuine connection has become impossible or unbearably painful to maintain. The merchant's insistence that Yulia remains with him, his warnings that she might bite unwary visitors, and his obvious affection for this invisible presence all suggest psychological processes that have transformed loss into presence through mechanisms that prioritize emotional survival over accurate perception of external reality. Yet the merchant's condition, however tragic, also demonstrates remarkable resilience and creativity in the face of circumstances that might otherwise prove completely overwhelming. His creation of imagined companionship represents not simply madness, but adaptive response to environmental conditions that exceed normal human capacity for psychological endurance. The elaborate internal world he has constructed allows him to continue functioning in practical ways, maintaining his business and providing services to other undead, while also meeting essential emotional needs that would otherwise remain completely unfulfilled. The alternative theory that Yulia represents the merchant's weapon his Uchigatana, transforms the relationship from fantasy of human companionship into something approaching spiritual connection with an object that has acquired personality and significance through long association and dependence. This interpretation draws support from the merchant's cry of anguish when he dies, a sound that could represent grief at separation from a cherished companion, regardless of whether that companion possesses independent consciousness or exists primarily as projected personality imposed upon an inanimate object. The practice of naming weapons and attributing personality characteristics to tools and equipment has deep historical roots in cultures where survival depends upon the reliability and effectiveness of implements that mean the difference between life and death. Warriors throughout history have developed intimate relationships with their weapons, treating them as trusted allies whose proper care and maintenance represents not mere practical necessity, but moral obligation to beings whose service and loyalty deserve recognition and reciprocity. In the context of the Dark Souls universe, where the boundary between animate and inanimate has become increasingly fluid through the influence of souls and magical forces, the possibility that weapons might develop forms of consciousness or personality becomes less fantastic and more simply another expression of the fundamental interconnectedness that characterizes all existence within these transformed realities. The merchant's relationship with his blade could represent genuine spiritual connection rather than mere psychological projection, communication with an entity that has achieved awareness through processes that transcend ordinary biological development. The warning that Yulia will bite those who approach carelessly gains different significance under this interpretation, transforming from evidence of delusional thinking into practical advice about the dangerous nature of a weapon that has been endowed with protective instincts toward its owner. The merchant's stroking motions around the barrel could represent maintenance activities, the kind of careful attention to cleaning and care that any responsible weapon owner provides, interpreted through psychological frameworks that attribute emotional significance to practical activities. Yet, even as we explore these various possibilities for understanding the merchant's relationship with Yulia, we encounter another theory that transforms the entire situation from tragedy of individual madness into mystery, with implications that extend far beyond the merchant's personal psychological condition. The suggestion that Yulia might have escaped from her original location and found her way to Blighttown, where she powers the Great Water Wheel through constant running, creates connections between apparently unrelated phenomena while raising questions about the nature of identity and agency within the Dark Souls universe. The massive water wheel that dominates the skyline of Blighttown's ramshackle structures operates through the efforts of what appears to be a single dog-like creature, running endlessly within its circumference to provide the mechanical power necessary for various industrial processes that continue despite the obvious decline and abandonment that characterizes much of the settlement. The persistence of this creature's activity, its apparent contentment with a task that would seem monotonous and purposeless to external observers, suggests either profound dedication to duty or complete disconnection from normal motivations and desires. The possibility that this running creature represents Yulia in a transformed or relocated state would explain both her disappearance from the merchant's immediate vicinity and her continued existence within the broader world, though it requires accepting forms of transformation and relocation that exceed normal understanding of how identity and consciousness operate. If Yulia did indeed possess some form of independent existence beyond the merchant's psychological projection, then her ability to move between locations and assume different roles demonstrates capabilities that transcend ordinary biological or even supernatural limitations. The investigation that revealed the dog's continued running even after being freed from the water wheel mechanism demonstrates dedication that exceeds simple mechanical conditioning, suggesting either profound psychological commitment to the running activity itself or connection to purposes and motivations that remain hidden from external observation. The creature's persistence in running, even when freed from external constraints that previously gave meaning to its activity, implies either tragic inability to adapt to changed circumstances or continued commitment to objectives that transcend immediate practical necessity. Yet this interpretation faces significant challenges from evidence that suggests the creature's running represents not voluntary dedication, but compulsive behavior that continues regardless of external circumstances or rational evaluation of its effectiveness. The revelation that the water wheel continues to operate normally, even after the creature has been permanently removed from its mechanism, indicates that the running served no essential function, that the apparent connection between the creature's activity and the wheel's operation was illusory rather than mechanical. This discovery transforms the running creature from an essential component of Blighttown's infrastructure into a tragic victim of circumstance, an entity whose entire existence has been devoted to activity that serves no purpose beyond the satisfaction of psychological needs that may themselves be based on false assumptions about the nature of duty, purpose, and meaningful action. The creature's continued running, after liberation, becomes evidence not of admirable dedication, but of inability to recognize when circumstances have changed sufficiently to make previous activities obsolete or counterproductive. The broader implications of this revelation extend beyond the specific circumstances of individual creatures to encompass questions about the nature of purpose and meaning within systems that have become so corrupt or dysfunctional that activities once genuinely necessary continue to be performed, long after they have ceased to serve any constructive function. The water wheel that operates independently of the creature's efforts becomes a metaphor for systems that perpetuate themselves through momentum and habit rather than continued relevance or effectiveness. The undead merchant's relationship with Yulia, whether understood as psychological adaptation to isolation, spiritual connection with a weapon, or memory of genuinely lost companionship, reflects broader patterns of meaning-making that characterize existence within the declining age of fire. The elaborate structures of significance that individuals create to make sense of their circumstances and maintain psychological stability often persist long after the conditions that originally justified them have ceased to exist, creating situations where continued adherence to familiar patterns becomes more important than accurate assessment of current reality. The barrels that appear throughout the Dark Souls universe, serving as containers for everything from valuable items to imprisoned individuals, represent a recurring motif that connects disparate locations and characters through shared experiences of confinement, concealment, and delayed revelation. The broken barrel beside the undead merchant gains additional significance when viewed as part of this broader pattern, transforming from simple environmental detail into symbol of the complex relationships between containment and liberation, hiding and revelation, protection and imprisonment. The room where Griggs of Vinheim was first discovered, filled with barrels that might have contained other prisoners or might have served as hiding places for valuable materials, suggests systematic use of such containers for purposes that extend beyond simple storage or transport. The proximity of these barrels to areas where merchants operate, where scholars conduct research, and where individuals seek refuge from hostile environments implies organized activities that utilize concealment and delayed access as integral components of their methodology. The butchers found in the depths, with their preparation tables surrounded by barrels that presumably contain materials related to their culinary activities, demonstrate another aspect of how containers serve functions that extend beyond obvious practical necessity. The presence of Laurentius of the Great Swamp imprisoned within one of these barrels suggests that the boundary between ingredient and person, between food preparation and population control, has become dangerously fluid within certain contexts. Laurentius's gratitude for rescue from his barrel prison, combined with his claim that he would have been eaten alive if assistance had not arrived, reveals the literal danger that such confinement represented, while also suggesting that his understanding of the threat he faced might have been incomplete or inaccurate. The butcher's preparation of food for consumption by entities other than themselves implies organized activities that serve purposes extending beyond immediate practical necessity, systems of food production and distribution that operate according to logic that remains partially hidden from those who encounter only fragments of the overall process. The giant rat discovered at the bottom of the chute system that connects various levels of the depths might represent the ultimate consumer for whom the butcher's activities are organized. Though the rat's own relationship to the broader ecosystem of the underground areas remains unclear, the feeding of this creature through systematic provision of prepared materials suggests domestication or alliance rather than simple pest management. Collaboration between different species or types of beings in service of objectives that transcend individual survival or immediate practical benefit. Yet even as we explore these various connections between barrels, merchants, and the complex systems of containment and revelation that they represent, we must acknowledge that the most profound mysteries often emerge not from elaborate theoretical constructions, but from careful attention to the simple human realities of loneliness, adaptation, and the persistent search for meaning and connection within circumstances that seem designed to frustrate such basic psychological needs. The undead merchant's conversations with Yulia, regardless of their objective reality or psychological accuracy, demonstrate forms of resilience and creativity that deserve recognition and respect, even when they arise from conditions that we might prefer to interpret as pathological or delusional. His ability to maintain hope, to create relationships where none exists, and to continue providing services to others despite his own obvious psychological distress represents achievement that transcends simple categories of success and failure, sanity and madness, adaptation and breakdown. The barrel that serves as focus for his projected companionship becomes not merely evidence of mental deterioration, but a monument to the human capacity for creating meaning and relationship under conditions that would seem to preclude both. His gentle care of this inanimate object, his attribution of personality and agency to something that cannot respond or reciprocate, and his obvious affection for this imagined companion, all demonstrate psychological processes that prioritize emotional survival and continued functioning over strict adherence to conventional definitions of reality and appropriate relationship. As we prepare to explore the deepest mysteries that surround transformation and identity, the relationships between individual consciousness and larger patterns of meaning, the connections between personal psychology and cosmic significance, we carry with us the insights gained from contemplating figures like the undead merchant and the elaborate internal worlds they create to make existence bearable and meaningful. We have discovered that the boundary between reality and imagination proves far more permeable than conventional wisdom suggests, that the most profound adaptations often emerge from the most desperate circumstances, and that the human capacity for creating meaning and relationship operates according to principles that transcend simple rational evaluation or objective verification. The mysteries that await us in the deepest layers of these ancient worlds will require similar appreciation for the complexity and creativity of consciousness operating under extreme conditions. Similar recognition that the most important truths often emerge not from external validation, but from internal necessity, and similar understanding that survival itself sometimes requires forms of relationship and meaning-making that exceed the boundaries of conventional logic and acceptable social behavior. Beneath the surface world, where mortal concerns play out their brief dramas against the backdrop of crumbling kingdoms and fading fires, there extends a realm so ancient and fundamental that it predates not only the current age, but the very concepts of beginning and ending that give structure to conscious experience. The Ash Lake spreads across distances that exceed the boundaries of conventional geography, its grey shores lapped by waters that reflect not sky but the infinite depths of possibility itself, while overhead stretches a canopy formed by trees whose magnitude dwarfs every human achievement, and whose roots reach down into the very foundations of existence. The everlasting dragons that once ruled this primordial landscape moved through environments that knew neither change nor the passage of time as later ages would understand these concepts, their massive forms as permanent and unchanging as the stone arches that supported the world itself. Yet even in that age of perfect stasis, even in those eons when variation itself was unknown and unimaginable, the seeds of transformation lay dormant in the spaces between certainties, waiting for the proper conditions to manifest the disparity that would shatter forever the grey uniformity that had defined all existence since the beginning of memory. The arch trees that tower above the Ash Lake represent more than mere botanical specimens, grown to unprecedented size through supernatural influence. These ancient giants serve as the fundamental infrastructure that supports the entire structure of reality, living pillars whose interconnected root systems and branching canopies create the framework within which all subsequent development and change became possible. Their presence transforms the lake from a simple geographical feature into something approaching a cosmic nexus, a point where the deepest principles that govern existence become visible to those who possess the wisdom and patience necessary for perceiving such profound truths. The journey that leads to this primordial realm requires more than simple physical travel through conventional space. The great hollow that provides access to the Ash Lake from the upper world serves as both literal passage and metaphorical representation of the psychological and spiritual transformation necessary for comprehending realities that operate according to principles fundamentally different from those that characterize surface existence. The descent through the hollow tree's interior recreates, in miniature, the process by which consciousness must strip away accumulated assumptions and familiar categories in order to perceive the underlying structures that support all apparent diversity and change. The enemies encountered during this descent, the creatures that have adapted to existence within the tree's interior spaces, demonstrate forms of life that transcend the conventional boundaries between plant and animal, organic and mineral, individual and collective, that define most surface encounters. These beings have evolved in response to environmental conditions that exist nowhere else in the known world, developing characteristics that reflect the unique challenges and opportunities presented by existence within a living structure whose own nature defies easy categorization or understanding. The cursed frogs that inhabit certain portions of this descent path serve as reminders that even the most ancient and fundamental realms remain vulnerable to the influences that have corrupted so much of the surface world. Their presence within the tree's interior suggests that the boundaries between different layers of reality remain permeable, that the conditions which created the undead curse and other supernatural afflictions can penetrate even into territories that might seem naturally protected from such intrusions. Yet, the tree's essential nature remains unaltered by these external influences, its massive structure continuing to serve its foundational functions despite the presence of elements that belong more properly to later and more corrupted ages. This resilience demonstrates principles of stability and endurance that transcend the temporary disruptions created by surface conflicts and supernatural disasters, suggesting that the deepest structures of reality possess forms of integrity that can withstand even the most dramatic challenges to established order. The discovery of the stone dragon at the lake's edge provides evidence that not all of the ancient powers were completely eliminated during the war that established the Age of Fire. This remnant of the primordial era exists in a state that transcends the simple categories of living and dead, present and absent, active and passive, that characterize most encounters with entities from later periods. Its stone-like appearance reflects not petrification or death, but a form of existence that participates simultaneously in the organic and mineral realms, embodying principles of endurance and patience that exceed ordinary biological limitations. The dragon's willingness to accept offerings from visitors and to provide access to the covenant that connects seekers with the deeper mysteries of draconic existence demonstrates that the ancient powers retain both awareness, agency, despite their apparent withdrawal from active involvement in surface affairs. This relationship between the dragon and those who approach it reverently suggests that the primordial era's influence continues to operate in the present, though in forms that require particular kinds of preparation and understanding to access effectively. The path of the dragon covenant that the stone dragon offers represents more than simple association with draconic powers or adoption of dragon-like characteristics through superficial transformation. This path constitutes a fundamental reorientation of consciousness toward principles that predate the dichotomies and conflicts that have defined existence throughout the Age of Fire, a return to ways of being that transcend the limitations imposed by the assumption that meaning must arise from opposition and struggle rather than from integration and harmony. The transformation that participants in this covenant undergo reflects not mere cosmetic alteration, but genuine adaptation to forms of existence that operate according to different temporal and spatial principles than those that govern ordinary human experience. The scales that develop on their skin, the changes in their basic physical structure, and the alterations in their relationship to conventional weapons and armor all suggest movement towards states of being that combine human consciousness with draconic endurance and perspective. Yet, even as we contemplate the significance of these voluntary transformations and the ancient powers that make them possible, our attention is drawn to mysteries that may prove even more fundamental to understanding the true nature of the Ash Lake and its relationship to the broader structure of reality. The massive skull that rests upon the lake's shore, its size and characteristics suggesting origins that exceed any known category of creature, presents questions about the history and development of this primordial realm that resist easy answers or comfortable conclusions. The skull's placement and condition suggest not recent death but ancient ending, the conclusion of processes that may have predated even the Age of Ancients and the establishment of the current cosmic order. Its size alone indicates that it belonged to an entity whose magnitude exceeded that of any known dragon, giant, or other massive creature encountered elsewhere in the Dark Souls universe, implying the existence of forms of life that have been completely erased from current knowledge and understanding. Theories attempting to explain the skull's origins range from relatively straightforward suggestions about unknown species of giants or dragons to more complex speculations about the nature of existence during periods that preceded all recorded history. The possibility that it represents the remains of one of the giants whose burial in the Tomb of the Giants created the massive sepulchres found in that underground necropolis gains some credibility from the skull's size and the beast's apparent age of its placement, but the significant differences between its characteristics and those of known giant species create complications for this interpretation. The alternative theory that the skull belonged to the Nameless blacksmith deity, whose harvesting of titanite from the archtrees provided the materials necessary for creating the most powerful weapons and armor in existence, transforms the lake from simple ancient landscape into the site of cosmic-level industrial activity. Under this interpretation, the archtrees serve not merely as support structures for reality, but as sources of materials whose properties exceed those of ordinary minerals and metals, substances whose manipulation requires capabilities that transcend normal craftsmanship and approach the realm of fundamental creation. The titanite chunks that can indeed be found in proximity to the archtrees provide some evidence for this theory, though the connection between these materials and the massive skull remains speculative rather than definitively established. The possibility that the skull represents the remains of an entity whose primary function involved the harvesting and processing of supernatural materials would explain both its presence in this location and its obvious importance to whatever cosmic processes shape the development of the current world order. Yet even as we explore these various theories about the skull's origins and significance, we must acknowledge that its true importance may lie not in its connection to any particular historical narrative, but in its function as a symbol of the kinds of mysteries that the Ash Lake contains and represents. The skull serves as a reminder that the lake exists as a repository for evidence of processes and entities that exceed current understanding, phenomena whose true nature may remain permanently beyond the reach of analytical investigation or theoretical speculation. The broader landscape of the Ash Lake, with its seemingly infinite expanse, and its population of archtrees extending beyond the horizon in all directions, suggests spatial relationships that transcend the conventional geographical framework that characterizes surface territories. The lake appears to exist partially outside normal space-time constraints, occupying dimensions that intersect with, but are not entirely contained within the familiar three-dimensional reality that defines most conscious experience. This spatial anomaly would explain the lake's function as a nexus point that provides access to multiple other locations throughout the Dark Souls universe, its archtrees serving as living gateways that connect distant territories through root systems and branching networks that operate according to principles of magic rather than physical geography. The Great Hollow that leads from Blighttown to the lake represents only one such connection among many, with other trees potentially providing access to locations that remain undiscovered or accessible only under particular conditions. The theory that each archtree serves as a portal to a different world or reality gains support from the observation that the trees appear to extend indefinitely in all directions, their numbers exceeding what any single geographical region could reasonably support through conventional ecological processes. If these trees indeed function as interdimensional gateways, then the Ash Lake serves as something approaching a cosmic transportation hub, a central point from which travelers could potentially access any location or realm that has ever existed or might exist in the future. This interpretation would cast the lake's apparent emptiness and desolation in an entirely different light, transforming it from evidence of decline or abandonment into indication of its true function as a space designed to facilitate movement and transition rather than permanent habitation. The lack of obvious civilization or development around the lake would reflect not failure to utilize its resources, but understanding that its primary value lies in its capacity to remain neutral and accessible to travelers from multiple realities and time periods. The presence of the stone dragon and other remnants of ancient powers within this transportation nexus would serve important practical functions, providing guidance and authentication services for travelers who might otherwise become lost among the infinite possibilities that such a system would make available. The Dragon's Covenant would function not merely as spiritual transformation, but as a form of cosmic passport, identifying participants as beings who have been properly prepared for navigation among realities that operate according to fundamentally different principles. Yet even as we contemplate these possibilities for understanding the Ash Lake as a cosmic nexus or interdimensional gateway, we encounter another theory that transforms our understanding of the entire location from ancient remnant to active component of ongoing natural processes. The suggestion that the giants found throughout the Dark Souls series eventually transform into archtrees upon their deaths would cast the lake not as a static repository of primordial powers, but as the culmination point of cycles that continue to operate in the present, the destination toward which all sufficiently large and long-lived entities naturally progress. The evidence for this theory derives primarily from observations of giant behavior and physiology in Dark Souls 2, where the creatures display characteristics that suggest gradual transformation toward plant-like states of existence. Their bark-like skin, their tendency to drop seeds upon death, and their apparent connection to cycles of regeneration and renewal all point toward natural processes that transcend the simple life-death dichotomy that characterizes most biological entities. The face holes that mark many of the giants encountered in Drangleic might represent not disfigurement or injury, but natural adaptation to forms of existence that depend more heavily upon root systems and chemical exchange than upon conventional sensory organs designed for surface navigation and prey detection. These openings could serve as connections to underground networks that link individual giants into collective organisms whose true scale and complexity exceed what surface observation can detect or measure. Under this interpretation, the giants' apparent hostility toward human activities reflects not simple territorial defense, but protection of delicate ecological processes that human interference might disrupt or damage. Their attacks on King Vendrick's forces and their apparent alliance with supernatural entities that oppose human expansion would serve not political or military objectives but conservation purposes, efforts to preserve environmental conditions necessary for the completion of natural cycles that operate across timescales far longer than those that characterize human planning and development. The transformation of giants into archtrees would represent not death but graduation to higher forms of existence, metamorphosis comparable to the transformation of caterpillars into butterflies, but operating according to temporal frameworks that make the process invisible to observers whose lifespans encompass only tiny fractions of the overall cycle. The apparent death of a giant would constitute merely the beginning of transformation processes that might require centuries or millennia to complete, eventually producing new archtrees that would take their place among the cosmic infrastructure that supports reality itself. This theory gains additional credibility when applied to the broader patterns of transformation that characterize the Dark Souls universe, where the boundaries between different states of existence prove far more permeable than conventional understanding would suggest. The hollowing process that affects humans, the transformation of demons through exposure to chaos fire, and the various other metamorphoses that occur throughout the series all demonstrate that change of fundamental identity represents not exception, but norm within these realities. The cycle that transforms giants into trees, and potentially transforms trees back into other forms of life, would provide a mechanism for the continuous renewal of the cosmic infrastructure that supports existence, ensuring that the fundamental structures remain capable of adapting to changing conditions while maintaining their essential functions. This would explain the apparent permanence of the Ash Lake, despite the dramatic changes that have affected every other aspect of the world during the transitions between different ages and cosmic orders. Yet, even as we explore these various theories about the nature of the Ash Lake and its relationship to the broader patterns of existence and transformation that characterize the Dark Souls universe, we must acknowledge that the most profound mysteries often resist resolution through any single explanatory framework. The lake exists simultaneously as a historical remnant, cosmic nexus, transformation, destination, and symbol of possibilities that exceed current understanding, its true significance emerging not from any particular interpretation, but from its capacity to accommodate multiple meanings without contradiction. The journey to the Ash Lake, whether undertaken by fictional heroes or theoretical investigators, represents more than simple exploration of an unusual geographical feature. It constitutes a pilgrimage to the foundations of existence itself, an encounter with realities that operate according to principles so fundamental that they shape everything that follows, while remaining largely invisible to ordinary consciousness. The lake serves as a reminder that beneath the familiar surfaces of experience, beneath the conflicts and struggles that dominate attention during normal existence, there persist structures and processes whose stability and endurance provide the foundation for all apparent change and development. As we prepare to conclude our exploration of these ancient mysteries and return our attention to the implications they hold for understanding the nature of existence, transformation, and the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic processes, we carry with us the profound sense of perspective that the Ash Lake provides. We have discovered that the most important structures often remain hidden from casual observation, that the most enduring processes operate according to timescales that exceed individual comprehension, and that the search for ultimate meaning may require journeys to territories that exist at the very boundaries of what consciousness can perceive and understand. The arch trees that support the world continue their patient work regardless of the surface dramas that capture immediate attention, their roots extending into depths that connect all possible realities, while their branches reach toward possibilities that have not yet achieved manifestation. In their silent persistence, in their connection to forces that transcend the temporary concerns of any particular age or civilization, they provide models for forms of existence that achieve significance through endurance and service rather than through conquest and dominance. And so our journey through the shadowed depths of these ancient mysteries draws to its gentle close, like the soft settling of ash upon waters that have reflected the rise and fall of countless ages. We have wandered together through territories where basilisks conceal their true eyes behind elaborate deceptions, where whispers echo through halls that have forgotten the voices that once gave them meaning, and where the boundaries between dream and reality dissolve into currents that flow according to principles older than memory itself. Through painted worlds and serpentine machinations, through the transformations of giants into living pillars that support existence itself, we have discovered that the most profound truths often hide in plain sight, concealed not through elaborate conspiracy, but through the simple human tendency to overlook what seems too obvious to merit careful attention. The merchants who speak to invisible companions, the knights whose corruption serves purposes they cannot comprehend, the gods whose exile becomes homecoming, all remind us that meaning emerges not from simple categories, but from the complex interplay of forces that transcend individual understanding. Perhaps the most beautiful revelation to emerge from these contemplations is the recognition that even our deepest confusions and most troubling uncertainties serve essential functions in the larger patterns that govern existence. The undead curse that seems like punishment becomes preparation for forms of consciousness that transcend ordinary limitations. The cycles that appear futile reveal themselves as necessary rhythms through which awareness gradually expands beyond its original boundaries. The darkness that threatens to consume everything proves to be the fertile void from which genuine renewal becomes possible. Rest now in this understanding, fellow seeker, and let these gentle mysteries carry you toward the peace that comes from recognizing that all questions eventually answer themselves in the fullness of time.